That we all stand up and just do a stretch. I know what the afternoon does to us, especially after having a bit of food. So I'm kindly requesting, let's all stand up and stretch a little bit. Because I know some of you from food directly, you came, sat here, stretch your neck, stretch your arms. Sitting very long is also not very good. It's healthy to be able to do some exercise. Okay. Because our moderator is ready, our moderator who is going to be taking us on the next panel. We can get seated now. Part of the team is still having lunch, but we will be able to start because we are about 16 minutes behind schedule. So welcome back from the morning session, which was a very interesting one, especially with regard to what justice means, away from the legal perspective of justice, but justice in the eyes of the victims. What does it mean? And from the morning it came out very clear that while we talk about this animal, this elephant in the room called justice, many at times we need to look back with the perspective of the victims. What would they want to see? Remember one of the panelists, who is also a victim, who said, some of these perpetrators look to be doing much better. They're much well off than even the victims themselves, which is quite unfortunate because that is what is depicted, that is what is seen. But also with the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court, it was very clear that it can only prosecute a handful. So can we be able to develop the capacities of the local courts in the different member states to be able to prosecute these cases? And we got to learn that sexual cases in conflict actually keep evolving. And so still, here the victims come in to be able to give all the dimensions, to be able to give us the different perspectives. One key aspect that came through, which also makes it a little bit difficult to prosecute, is the idea of evidence. Because this is someone who has gone through trauma, there is a lot of social setbacks, and then you're asking them to come and testify. That has also been a drawback in the prosecution of sexual violences in conflict. So we need to think through how we can be able to better that. We're going to go on to our second panel for this afternoon. And the second panel is particularly going to be looking at balancing global climate commitments with Africa's development needs. This afternoon, during the lunchtime news, there was a conversation on how about we forgive the debt of African countries, just thinking about out loud, because that is what some organizations were saying. They were saying that because of the commitment, many of the African budgets that should have gone to a development agenda are going to debt repayment. But at the end of the day comes in the question of responsibility. You get the loan to be able to do development. Have you utilized it in the very best way? There are lots of commitments with regard to climate conversations, but what is the African context right there? Vis-a-vis as well the development needs, in as much as there is a lot that needs to be done. And without any further ado, allow me invite our moderator for this afternoon, none other than the Chief Advancement Officer and Deputy Chief International Relations Officer at Makerere University, Mr. Awel, to come and take us through this very interesting panel. I know we've eaten up about 20 of your minutes, but we'll pay them back. Let's give him a round of applause.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you so much, Mildred. Good afternoon, everybody. And welcome to the 2024 Kampala Geopolitics Conference. We have another 90 minutes to have a very interesting conversation on balancing the global climate commitments with Africa's development needs. And we have some very interesting people who are going to take us through this what is usually a very complex subject to discuss, but we'll try and simplify it so that we all can understand this challenge of climate change and the development, pushing the development agenda for Africa. My name is Awel Wihanganye, as Mildred has said, and I support the Vice Chancellor's Office as the Chief Advancement Officer. So I'll take you through the next 90 minutes. I'd like to invite my panel who are going to be discussing this issue with me. And I'll start with my senior colleague, Professor Yazid Bamtaze, who is the Deputy Principal at the College of Agriculture and Environmental Sciences at Makerere University. You're welcome, Professor. And then we have Mr. Arthur Chimeze, who is the Project Manager at the Climate Finance Unit, the Ministry of Finance and Planning and Economic Development, and the Project Manager for the Climate Finance Global Green Growth Institute. Welcome, Arthur. We have Arthur Melissa, who is going to be joining us. He was traveling from Hoima earlier, so he got stuck in traffic, but hopefully he will find us when we're in conversation. So great. So back to the topic that we're going to discuss. Like I said, I'm no climate change expert, but I'm passionate about development and social change and political action. So I like to think because of that, it sort of gives me some context to be able to maybe ask some questions or explore some insights that sort of give us an insight into the effect of climate change, the challenges of balancing development and sustainable, build sustainable systems, and also our environment. So the topic basically is described in the book that we all have. But the idea is, how do we have a conversation where Africa, which still is one of the most poorest parts of the world, with huge development challenges, is being asked to develop differently from the way other parts of the world have developed. And part of that is that the Western world, which is the first world, they call it the first world, and now China as well, which is one of the fastest growing parts of the world, and India, have grown through like mass industrialization, which has had a very negative impact on the climate and the environment that we all depend on to survive and to create. So in this case, if these countries have developed through industrialization, which has not been very good for the environment, and Africa is still really on the way to build its own capacity to create economic opportunities for its people, jobs for its young people, how do we then develop and develop sustainably, not do as much harm as the other parts of the world have had on the environment? And also, how do we build capacity to be able to do that in a way that is affordable and sustainable? So our panel is going to be able to give us those insights. I will start off by asking maybe Professor Yazidi to, each one of you guys, to give your own take on the subject matter. You know, how can Africa balance its development needs with the needs for building sustainable futures for our planet? So we can have, each one of you maybe have like 5-10 minutes to explore this, and then we can go into the specific questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, moderator. A very good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for the opportunity to have a conversation on this very, very important topic. I tend to believe, moderator, that when we look at climate change, although you indicated that it's a complex matter, I want to believe that we are talking to people who are already converted or who already know something about climate change. If you look at the history, you can even argue that it's the most discussed, it's the most debated issue in the entire history of this earth. It has been discussed at global level, continental level, regional level, subnational level, national level, up to the level of our households or individual. And we have seen an evolution of climate change. For some of us who are a little bit in the other generation when the conversation started, we used to see this very beautiful map of Uganda. It's one of the things that was being illustrated at global level, how coffee production would be wiped out with climate change that was coming. We've seen this transcend, starting with largely a group that you can say are meteorologists, people of physics and chemistry, moving on to a level where one can argue that at present it's more of a social, it's more presented and discussed from the social, economic, cultural context than where it started from. We've seen from the science point of view, for those, again, who are following the events, we started with this so-called global saturation models. Again, I don't want to go into the details of that, but in brief, you could get a country like Uganda being split into 4 grids, so to say, and you have one value for each of those grids. Really cost data. There has been a movement away from that into understanding things in a more precise way. So you have a little bit of that sort of evolution and trajectory. One can even argue that we have moved from the point of science, the point of skeptics. You remember that time when you had a group of those who believe in climate change, those who don't believe in climate change, and the evidence is overwhelming from what we have felt, from what the science has delivered. To situate the question you have asked in a much better way, we now need to understand the context from many angles. Context from the geographical angle, from the socio-economic angle, and that kind of stuff, because that's where the actions will have to come in. As a person who is coming from academia, there are always these debates. You can talk about climate change, globalization or globalism or universalism, and then you can also talk about climate change localism, which shouldn't be very difficult to understand in the light of the fact that you are talking about global commitments. What are these global commitments and where are they coming from? When you speak about balancing between environmental and climate change and development, you can also raise a question here and there that are these really in competition, that if there is a competition, then you need to get to a state of balance, a state of peace, a state of agreement. I think that owing to this evolution which has been there for a period of time, there has been lots of lessons learned. There have been lots of evidence that has accumulated that you now can argue or you can claim that we are currently in the phase of innovation or the phase of opportunities. If you downscale this and look at it at the level of the African continent, or you look at it even at the national level, how does it fit in? What are these commitments? I tend to think that the year 2015 was really fundamental in shifting the conversation from the notion of, accusations, from the notion of economics, from the notion of trade-off, into broadly understanding this whole elephant of sustainability or low carbon development. And what does it mean? If you go to 2025, it really defines the global development agenda, if you want to summarize it. You're looking at the Paris Agreement with whatever is inherent there. You are looking...
Prof, if I could interrupt a bit, I'd like to, again, the balance, you talked about the balance between development and considerations for building a sustainable future for our climate. What could be like those things? I mean, it would be, because you have such a great experience in this, whether it's agriculture, in areas of agriculture where you have expertise, or even just other elements of production.
Yes, sir.
How can we create a balance within the context that we are discussing for pursuit of development?
Okay. So my argument is that, firstly, there is unanimity or convergence of opinion that we need to pursue what you can call the low carbon economy or development based on sustainability. And therefore, the notion of competition is sort of diminished in one way. Even when you go to the economists, I'm not an economist, but when you see the economists converging to the understanding that you need to tackle climate change, then they have seen that it's not looking at this as bringing problems to the economy, but it's rather looking at what has been agreed as sort of presenting opportunities that we have to tap into in order to propel development from all angles, whether it's economic development, whether it is social development, whether it's catering for, what do you call them, the excluded demographics, okay? You're talking about maybe gender, you are talking about youth, you talk about agriculture, who is in agriculture and how are you performing as a continent, how are you performing as a country, what are the implications of climate change on that sector. And now you could look at it from two angles, and I think that's where I see a little bit of a challenge, especially with the African context. You look at the advocacy is too much rooted into presenting and framing the issue from the vulnerability component. We are vulnerable because we are poor. We are vulnerable because of this. We are vulnerable because of this and the other. Those cannot be disputed factually. But there is also the other angle, that how do you take advantage of the opportunities that have presented themselves? Now, when you go to the level, to the global level, and you look at the conversations, examine the Paris Agreement and what it comes with, you look at the different COPs, Conference of Parties, what has been discussed, what has been agreed. When you examine it at the national level and you look at what have countries committed themselves to do within the space of climate change and the need to address it. You're looking at mitigation, you are looking at adaptation. There are commitments at the global level, even in terms of the finances. 100 billion committed by developed countries to be available in order to propel actions that should make countries and societies more resilient. Do we have the capacity to tap into those resources that are available? For me, that's now the bigger picture of how you can translate this, transform it, create opportunities in order to take advantage of those opportunities. And then you can change the mindset, you can change the conversations, you can change the people, you can change the systems, you can change the institutions, you can change the policies to build development from all angles that is taking care of the climate issues.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Prof. I think you talked about global commitments, and I think this is where Arthur is a bit of an expert, and he'll give us an insight into, do these global commitments even work for us in terms of saying, do not develop the way we did, but we're going to pay you off and compensate you so that you can keep your forests, and we would like to have like a bit of a better understanding of what that means, of saying, we don't want you to develop the way we did, we don't want you to get your minerals out of the ground, you know, because of these other factors. We don't want you to exploit your oil in a way that provides opportunities for your people because it's not good for them, but we're going to pay you.
Yeah.
Does that even work for us? But even before you go into that question,
Yeah.
Arthur, it would be good for us, again, give us a broader take on this subject of balancing development against the sustainable future of our climate.
Yeah.
No, sorry, Arthur. Yeah. I was going to Arthur. Sorry, Prof.
Okay.
Yeah, I was just jumping to Arthur. Yes,
okay.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you very much. I'll make an effort to match the professor's eloquence. In regard to the broad topic, I was writing down a couple of things when you asked the question on how we think about sustainable future for Africa in a changing climate and in terms of the dimensions of development. And very specifically, we need to interrogate that question from the perspective of what Professor was saying. Uganda has a commitment, so for instance, we are part of a treaty of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which, as he said, has the element of the Paris Agreement. There is a principle there, which is a principle of common but differentiated responsibilities. It doesn't necessarily mean that Uganda, as we are able to articulate proper ambition and also fund it. Professor mentioned two specific responses that have been following, that the Conference of Parties have been following for many years, and that's mitigation and adaptation. And more recently in the Conference of Parties, we are also looking at loss and damage as a thematic area, and we are looking also at cross-cutting. So there are elements that are not defined specifically as mitigation or adaptation, but they have bits of mitigation and bits of adaptation. If we were to define, adaptation is increasing resilience to climate change. So for instance, if you come from an area that has been maybe depending on cattle production, you come from a cattle corridor, beef production, milk production, the changing climate is going to affect your ability to produce good quality beef, good quality milk, probably because of increasing water insecurity. So an adaptation project, therefore, would be a project that would increase your resilience by increasing water security and or dealing with water security. It could be an issue of maybe you have breeds of animals like Saiwal or Borans that are able to stay longer, that are able to sustain themselves throughout longer drought periods. Or on the other hand, it could be technologies that might improve your ability to draw water from the ground or even store water above ground. But also moving the other end, so the mitigation element could be anything that enhances greenhouse gas sinks or that prevents a greenhouse gas from going into the atmosphere. So if you look at a very specific context of a homestead, if you are looking at the fraction of non-renewable biomass in your fuel, wood fuel at home, so fuel, you cannot just demonize, and this is now contextualizing it for Uganda. You can't just come from up on high and say we don't want charcoal, because in some circumstances, a few circumstances of course, in some circumstances, some of this wood fuel is actually green charcoal. People planted their trees to produce charcoal. And if these trees are planted in a manner that can be, it's renewable, it's not different from hydroelectric power in that specific sense. And also hydroelectric power, even if it was to be looked at as clean, has specific carbon emissions related to the production of that power. But that's just now in terms of the definition of where we are and how simple things could be. But there are also, and I think maybe that will be the next stage of the conversation, about the kind of instruments that we can use to draw the climate finance from the rest of the world into African countries, into African contexts. And some of these instruments are bonds, they are carbon markets. When we were still seated in the other end of the auditorium, the lady Mildred who opened the session spoke about, probably previously they had discussed forgiveness of debt. So there is an element, there's a modality which is called debt for nature swap or debt for climate swap. All these are modalities and tools that are available and that could be good for African governments. Now, sometimes they are two-edged swords. So for instance, I would like to dwell a bit on the question of debt, if you don't mind, Awel. So many times if you look at the constitution of the debt, or even the negotiation of a debt for nature swap, it brings into question the specific sovereignty of states, and also there are connotations that maybe the state has failed to manage their debt. So some of these are perception problems, but it's not something that we should shy away from discussing, because if you're saying that, let me keep my nature such that we switch a certain amount of debt repayment to making sure that nature is propelled, is it because you think I've failed to pay back my debt or something like that? So there is an element there for strengthening. And then in terms of the specific responses, like Professor Yazid was talking about, there are supposed to be responses on capacity building and institutional strengthening. That's going to help Africa specifically, because again, when you look at the common but differentiated responsibilities that we're discussing, we all have a common responsibility as a world, as a globe, to tackle climate change. But they are differentiated. Our abilities as African countries to deal with climate change are far different from countries in the Western world. And in fact, at the very beginning, Professor has taken us through a good chronology, that there have been many conventions, starting with the Rio 20+ convention. And there was something there called the Kyoto Protocol. And the Kyoto Protocol was one of the first, I think, mechanisms through which we saw market mechanisms as a response to climate change. And the first response market mechanism was, one of them was CDM, the Clean Development Mechanism. The Clean Development Mechanism was in these developing countries. What in the in the agreement, which is the Rio 20+ agreement, there are countries that were Annex 1 countries. These are countries that must do something about climate change because of their historical contributions to climate change. So the countries which at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution had something to do with climate change or had some sort of industry contributed to the climate change that we are facing today. Because, as Professor would say, some of the particulate matter that is in the sky can live there for hundreds of years. So some of this did not come from Namamve, obviously, from our industries here, or in Nairobi, or where, no. On the other hand, there are countries that are called non-Annex 1 countries. So the non-Annex 1 countries are parties like Uganda, like Kenya, and other low-developing countries, middle-developing countries, and so on. So in the context of how we're now wrapping up to the question of how do we not develop until you are able to do this? How do you do a low carbon pathway? How do you do green growth? All this is the kind of support that we need to gear ourselves as nation states in Africa, research institutions in Africa, centers of excellence like Makerere University, to prepare ourselves. One, for instance, the centers of excellence in different states in Africa can prepare themselves to support their nation states to be able to advance the agenda. You need to be able to contribute. Professor was telling us about articulating our ambitions. When we articulate our ambitions, it's something called the National Determined Contributions, the NDCs. When you are articulating that ambition, it has got to be steeped in fact. It has to be factual. It has to be based on scientific analysis and study. So that's the sort of like a position that a good institution like Makerere would have, or another research institution. It could be a regional institution. And there are also different opportunities. I know you'll ask these questions, but there are also different opportunities like for regional economic commissions. I can see from the makeup of the room that there are people from different parts of Africa. So there are different regional economic commissions that bring us together to discuss at the levels maybe of directors of finance or heads of state. Some of these are SADC, ESC, COMESA, and others like that. There are all sorts of different instruments that we can tap into as African nation states. I think that's sort of like enough for the beginning.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Arthur. And I think to just maybe continue with your thought, like I said, you're the finance expert on this climate. You've done so much work with the government of Uganda to build the government capacity to utilize these different commitments, global commitments for sustainable policy making within the development agenda for the country. So countries like Uganda are, as you said, there's all these global commitments that we're committed to, right? And so those commitments is sort of like inform how we develop, because in many ways, again, developing countries still get a lot of development funding from the more developed countries. So to access some of these resources that we badly need for even building capacity to extract and use the natural resources for economic development, you still need a lot of support. But do we have capacity? What kind of capacity do we have for negotiations? You know, in these commitments, this process of negotiations and making commitments, what is our capacity? What is the capacity for Africa to negotiate itself a good deal, to be able to chart its own way by recognizing we all recognize that climate change is real. There's a negative impact on the climate. We all need to do something. But what is our capacity to actually negotiate a deal that's good for Africa?
Yeah, thank you very much. I think I'll start and then Professor will say something after. So in the specific circumstances of Africa on climate change, so Uganda will have a team that will be present there. And the team will have members that are, representing the different thematic areas. For instance, Professor talked about the youth and gender. Those are there. We're also going to have members on adaptation, mitigation, and also the cross-cutting themes like finance. Those will also be there. The question you ask is very tricky in terms of what is our capacity. There is always a need for more capacity. That's the truth. But also Uganda is a member of different negotiation blocks, because you see at the excuse me, at the global scale, we always need to be coming together to be able to advance common goals. And sometimes if you come together with more people that are similar to you, you perform better. So Uganda is part of a group of negotiators, which is the African group of negotiators. We are part of the least developed countries group of negotiators. We also, because we are chairman of G77 plus China, we are also now part of that large block of negotiators. Because if you are part of a larger block of negotiators, then your capacity is enhanced to be able to push a certain position. Because remember, all the member states, which are more than 148 or so of the UN, are going to be doing something or are going to be pushing a certain position paper. So these negotiations start, for instance, in Bonn. In May every year, we go to Germany in Bonn and start to have negotiations on different agenda items. And then we situate ourselves well as Uganda to say this is what we want, but also as part of these groups that I've mentioned, this is what we possibly could get. And then in November, it's just sort of like the rubber stamping where heads of state also are around. But I also would like to again put it back. I attended Makerere University. Allow me to say a point of personal privilege that I attended Makerere University. And it would be nice for institutions like this to also set up systems or mechanisms which would be bringing up young negotiators or young climate change, not activists. Because you see, an activist is the individual who's going to come out and say, oh, the planet is burning down and so on. But rather we want to have a set of individuals, like he talked about, physics, chemistry, but there's also biology, commerce, business, and so on. Individuals who understand the specific contributions of the value chain they're in. So for instance, if I want to be in business, what's the specific contribution of business to climate change? And what's the specific contribution of crowding in private sector financing in solving a climate change problem? So for instance, if you're going to go and issue a bond at Bank of Uganda, how about we issued a green bond? The green bond would be ring-fenced. And so we're not doing infrastructure in this space, but rather we are doing maybe climate-proofed infrastructure, like in Kasese, where whenever we have a flood or some of these disaster risk-prone areas, we have this sort of situation. But of course, the question was on capacity for negotiators. So I would like to turn it back to Professor now, maybe. Yeah.
Yes, Prof. And just really, capacity also includes, I mean, it's different tools that one brings to the table for negotiations, right? What do we really have to bring to the table to push, to say, no, we're going to resist what could be, what's being proposed to us, is that good for us? Do we have capacity to say, no, we can do it differently, maybe in our own way?
Thank you, Awel. The framing of the question really assumes that you are like in a competition where you have one team here and another team here, so it's binary. It's like one football club against the other, and then you are going into that. I think not that I think, but that's the way it is. When you talk about negotiations, then you are looking at these platforms that have been created to have a candid conversation based on the understanding of issues, based on the understanding of science, based on the understanding that we are all converted on the notion of developing in a sustainable way, in whatever way you can sort of unpack that. And that's what you essentially have when you have 195 countries ratifying the agreement at the global level. Now, that doesn't take away, you're going to be together, but what capacities do you have? Are we talking about capacity to negotiate as an individual? You're a diplomat, you can convey the message in a precise way and convince the others to take it? That's one dimension. Is it capacity of having the relevant science? Because when you come to climate change, you are in most cases starting from your scientific base that is going to guide you in order to put certain things on the table. And I think for the case of Africa, or for the case of developing countries, particularly those from Africa, that's where you can argue with a great weight that we are lacking a strong knowledge and a scientific base to go on the table and present evidence that if you do A, you're going to end up with B. And it doesn't stop there. It also comes to issues that have already been presented. Do you have the capacities to tap into those resources? If you scan, the world, you realize that there are certain countries, even when you come to climate financing, China, they prepared themselves better, looked at the science, looked at the methodologies, and they are able, to get a lot of money from that angle. You come to Africa, you see a very strong correlation between the scientific development or knowledge that is coming from a certain country into how much they are able to tap into the resources that are available. That's not something that you can develop in just one day, but you must have that conscious that you have to develop capacities at all levels and then develop your ecosystem. If you are going for this negotiation, you need to have that buffet, that cocktail of people that are going to help you to respond to certain issues. Now, at the global level, you understand that it's really largely government negotiations. That's where things are going to be signed, irrespective of you have academia, you have NGOs, you have the youth, they are doing advocacy. When it comes to the fundamentals, you need a government. Even when you come here, you realize that, anything to do with climate change, global level, it's working with governments, which is okay anyway. But mobilize and develop your capacities to be in a better position. Do not also forget, like he has indicated, when you do these regional groupings, of course, it's a recognition that you are bundling in order to fight in a better way or to put things in a much better way. You reinforce each other. That's the whole notion about grouping or networking. Africa, as a continent, is so huge. It's very diverse. It's very heterogeneous. Whether you look at it from the morphological angle, you look at it from the climatological angle, you look at it from the biodiversity, the culture, the language. So to piece that up together and put up a comparing argument and articulation is quite daunting, but it has to be done, okay? And I think because of that, that's why sometimes then it's much easier to move from the core and come to present yourselves as being vulnerable, which is okay. But you need time to grow that capacity in different ways and be able to put up a comparing team, comparing argument, and then you can slice a larger piece of the cake.
Thank you, Prof. And Arthur, before you come in, I just wanted to say, the way I see this is an economic issue. That's how I see it.
Yes.
And that's why I keep going back to the point of what's the capacity for Africa to negotiate. It may have differences in terms of methodology or climate and all that, but I think what's constant, what's common is the underdevelopment of most of the countries in Africa. Yeah. And I think the conversations between the first world or the most developed world and regions like Africa and others is the question of economics.
Yes.
What are we really giving away? What are we being asked to give away? You know what I mean? And what's our capacity to actually, so Arthur, maybe you can tap into that. And, you know, this is I find this always a very difficult conversation to have. So please prepare to ask some poignant questions so that we're able to get our panel to dig deeper into this so we can all learn together. So Arthur, please.
Yeah, thanks. I've been itching to say something again because Professor said something about what we put on the table. And then I realized that your question had a second side to it. Like, what are we really bringing? And you know, many times negotiations are underpinned by the principle or notion of we leave nobody behind. So from the very sense of that, they can't leave us behind. The negotiations won't happen if we are not there. The negotiations won't happen if Africa is not on the table. It would be a scandal if in Baku this year, all African negotiators stood up and left. Because, you know, so that's what we're bringing to the table. What in essence is really happening. If you see this from the point of view, and of course, I'm cognizant of the fact that we are in a university, so poetic license is permitted here, and some level of intellectual rigor. But if we see it from the point of view that these people come to these negotiations because they also need something from Africa, then we start to ask ourselves, what do they need? They need these huge swaths of equatorial rainforest because they need it to sink all this carbon. They need the carbon to be sequestered somewhere. And the swaths of equatorial rainforest need to be enhanced. They need to be multiplied. They need to be managed well. The peatlands, the swamps need to be able to sequester all this carbon. They also need to have us grow at a slower rate, especially in terms of how much greenhouse gases we put out there, because the abatement cost in Africa, in a developing country like ours, is much lower. So for instance, the cost of transport in a developed country could be low, what you pay on the ticket, but the specific cost that went into establishing that infrastructure was much higher, even in terms of how many emissions went into, you know, developing an underground or developing an airline or, you know, flying an airline and so on. So they need us to be able to sustain the world much longer, because otherwise sea level rise is real, and there is real evidence that anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions are the real cause of climate change. Now you need to have the areas which have an ability not to reverse climate change but to slow it, to be able to be in this room. So I think that's what we bring to the table, and I think the more we appreciate that and then pragmatically come up with solutions that can draw resources, leveraging that, you know, leveraging our all survival. Yeah.
So the question is that the best way to use our resources? Do we need to conserve? I think that's where now the debate is. And
yes.
If you're saying, do we need to conserve our forests so that it can save the rest of the world?
Yes.
What are we really getting in return? What is the dilemma for us? Because in the end,
yeah,
I mean, the whole world will be affected.
Yes.
In many ways, the argument is that developing countries, including Africa, are the most affected by climate change, and yet we are the ones who are polluting even less. So
how do we convert that opportunity into resources for our economies? That's the question, not so?
Yeah.
Two things. So for instance, if we stay in line with that specific question on forestry, we are looking at forest carbon credits. So forest carbon credits would be, for instance, if you looked at a baseline, Professor talked about methodologies. If you look at a baseline where this is a place which has maybe been degraded, so you have liberated all the carbon by burning it as charcoal. You've liberated it and are going to take it into the atmosphere. There is a methodology with which you can compute how much carbon can be stored in certain specific species of trees, standing crop of this number of years, and so on. And then there are different mechanisms. So for instance, right now, the whole world doesn't have a properly working Article 6.2. So Paris Agreement, Article 6 talks about transferable mitigation options, which would be emissions reductions purchases between countries. So a country like Japan or Germany wants to meet certain targets. There are certain emissions targets, and they can come down here and purchase credits. So right now we don't have a working 6.2. We call that Article 6.2. But then there is voluntary market through which some of these can be sold. But on the other hand, there are also other complementary services markets, like what we call RED+, reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation plus conservation. So the plus is conservation, enhancement of livelihoods, and all these sorts of things that then also compute and give you a cost of carbon, a cost of 1 ton of carbon dioxide equivalent, and which can be tradable, and which can also help with our drawing rates from the World Bank or from other places from which we can be drawing money.
Okay.
Yes.
Brilliant. Professor, do you want to add on before we go for questions to the audience?
Your question, like you say, is complex. You're always presenting it as us vis-a-vis them.
But it is true, Professor.
Yeah.
Isn't it that way, though? It is us because there's one part of the world which is fully developed, built its capacity, has a much higher levels of standards of living, has better health, better everything. There's another part of the world where it's the direct opposite. Now, the other one says, we built our capacity this way, but you cannot do the same. So we are actually two worlds. It's not one and the same.
Well, I don't know how you delineate those two.
And we are the ones guaranteeing the other one.
You, as a geographer, where are you putting the line? Are you putting it at the equator and say, you have the north, you have the south? Are you putting it at the meridian and say you have, the west and you have the east? Unpack that and delineate, and then you can learn in a much better way. So here you have Africa developing. Is Asia considered developed, or it is developing? It gives you a mixture of the two. And then you can go to Europe, you can go to the US. You can even go to Latin America. In that way, you situate yourself in a much better way to look at things in a helpful manner. I'll give you an example. We look at biodiversity, for example, richness. Or let's simplify it. Even if you just talk about forests, you've spoken about forests. The evidence is sufficient from studies that where you have rich biodiversity or where you have forests, the nearby agricultural productivity and yields are going to be higher because you're getting pollinators that are helping in your agriculture and in your yields. That has nothing to do with them versus us. It's a case of understanding your system and your context in a much better way. So how do you want to develop? When you look at your national development plan, you look at your development aspirations, Vision 2040, it's still largely agriculture. How are you going to enhance your agriculture? Then you broaden the conversation to the global level. You can talk about climate change. To the local level, you can now talk about those nitty-gritties that feed into your development trajectory. You are going to end up, when you degrade your land, you are now going to end up asking your farmers, your smallholder farmers, 2 hectares and below, to start buying fertilizers. Until very recently, Uganda had the lowest fertilizer application rate. Why? There are many reasons, but one could argue one of the issues could have been that you still have a sufficient, in relative terms, I'm talking about relative terms, of nutrients available to support agriculture. Now, you see a change into that these days now many of the farmers have to buy fertilizers in order to sustain productivity. If you go in the economics, you actually realize that many of them, if you go into typical economics, is making losses in one way or the other, but it's some kind of occupation. How do you reverse that? Then you can look into those natural assets that can help to reduce the cost at that level and sustain and build resilience of systems, resilience of people, resilience of the economy. You build a peaceful environment based on a holistic understanding of those issues that are creating stresses here and there.
And of course, part of what's creating crisis is outside of our environment, because the farmers can no longer rely on predictable climate because of the impact that's coming from somewhere else, not here. Of course, there are other factors like population pressures and all that, but I think what is real is one of the biggest challenges to Africa dealing with this issue. It's external, actually, to Africa. But let's open it up to questions and conversations, and then we can explore. I think there's a gentleman there, and there, 3, then 4. So we'll do 1, 2, 3, then 4. Then we'll, yeah. Somebody's moving the mic. Okay, so we can start from there. We can start from here, then go this side. Yeah.
Thank you very much, the moderator and the panel. My question goes to Professor. First of all, I would love to have a comment on the recent threat that is coming to us here in Uganda, and that is the European Union deforestation regulations. First of all, those laws are retrospective. Furthermore, the laws, the threat is coming, I think, in December 2024. The second question, would you love to comment on the aspect of how the circular economy could be of great importance in combating climate change? Then we all know that despite the many things that they will come up with, deforestation, burning fossil fuels and all that, but we know that the biggest driver of climate change is actually consumption. So if no one is willing to curb their consumption, then we shall always have the same cycle repeating. For example, I think I've observed Mr. Arthur's hand. He has a smartwatch on that hand. He has a smartphone. He's having a lot of gadgets maybe with him. And you know that all those gadgets need to be charged. That means you are continuously consuming power. And we can imagine if we have 1,000 people living a similar lifestyle to that, that means no matter what measures we put up to combat climate change, we shall keep having the same results. So those are my queries.
Thank you.
And the last part, my name I forgot, it's Mukisa James from Uganda Christian University.
Thank you so much. Very good pointed questions. There was, okay, there's a lady here, and then we can go that side. Oh, yes, go ahead, Mohammed. Then we can come to you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Moderator. My name is Chigundu Mohammed, a second-year master's student pursuing a master's of adult and community education with a research focus in climate change education. Now, in his presentation, the first presentation, Professor Yazid talked of Africans that are doing what we call maybe deforestation because they are poor. And in regards to climate change, this is actually a problem and it is alarming. Now, considering Uganda's deforestation rate and charcoal significancy in the household energy, it is scary and alarming because maybe they are doing deforestation in search for a place where to stay. Given the alarming deforestation rates in Uganda, largely driven by charcoal production, what potential do you see in implementing ecological compensation schemes focused on reforestation efforts? And specifically, maybe we could explore, let's say, incentives like tree planting initiatives to offset charcoal-related deforestation, incentivizing sustainable charcoal production practices, and integrating agroforestry models to reduce pressure on the natural forests. How feasible are these strategies in the context of Uganda? And what policy reforms or stakeholder engagements would be necessary to implement the effective of these incentives? The second question
Thank you, Mohammed. Let's just give someone else an opportunity, and then we'll come back to you. There's a lady there.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kwagala Dokas from Uganda Christian University. And my question is, Professor, you talked about fertilizers. And they've been really given to very many farmers all over the country. But now there is this problem with organically modified products, whereby, for instance, maize, some farmers, in order to get it, they can plant it, but in order to plant it again, they will consume it, but then they'll have to go back to specific institutions where they got the product from in order to plant it again, which means that the products they get, they cannot really have a sustainable income or consumption on them, which means they have to keep on going back to those specific institutions. So you as a professor, what would you suggest that these products that are produced, they can still have a long year or income or a sustainable term for consumption without needing to go back to these specific institutions to request for more products?
Thank you. We'll just have one last one here. Okay, there's two here. There's two ladies, and then we'll come back. We'll have a bit of time. We'll come to, yeah.
Good afternoon.
Hey.
Yes.
Okay, then you have to come down again. Yes.
My question goes to, I think, Mr. Arthur, but I'll touch on what the professor had also mentioned. From what I believe, as it is, Mr. Arthur, you just talked about how we have a role to play. Each of us has a role to play, especially in this commitment, in fulfilling these commitments in climate change, right? And in a similar way, the professor had also talked about the need for scientific development in these fields. Right now, as much as you said during these interactions and negotiations, you have negotiators and government agents, as it is, who are on the round table. But at which point do they represent the smallholders, whether it's in the farming level, the processing level, the consumption level, who are meant to be the main implementers to help with these commitments? Because that's where, to be honest, that's where most of the impact comes from. So at which point in time have you been able to bridge that gap in information between the smallholders in Uganda, for example, and smallholders in the Western world who would have information on, for example, a field like biogas, which a farmer would want to implement here, but you not have that information as it would be available to a farmer in the Western world? Thank you.
All right, thank you so much. My name is Esther Awor, a student of law at Uganda Christian University. mine is in regards to even the moderator's assertions of the first world countries and how they are managing development, but also trying to leverage climate change and not us repeating the same mistake. Do you think something like carbon offsetting can work for a country like Uganda? For example, you have countries like Netherlands that is purely on water. Their country literally lives, they have dikes everywhere, they have dams everywhere, but they're still, their country is literally on water, right? And then you have countries like the US and France where you have urban areas, but then also you have forests outside the outskirts. There are forests and farms. So do you think that such a system can actually work for a country where you have industrial areas, but also set up forest reserves that can maybe try to carbon offset the carbon that is emitting from these different industries, and then those forests are going to be able to sustain that kind of environment so that there's some form of ecosystem? Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. My name is Kaoru Chazekakoza, and I run a farm, a data forensics farm. And I was invited by Anna from the next conference, so I'm very happy I'm here because I work a lot with agriculture. I'm asking Professor, why are we pushing an agenda that we can actually reverse? I have a database of almost 600,000 farmers, 386 data points per household. And the fertilizer problem is growing because somebody's promoting it. EUDR is not our problem because it is actually stopping afforestation from the gentleman that came in. Yes, there will be stringent issues when it comes to whatever we promote, but isn't it helping us? And how much of the coffee farmers are going to, be in this space? So I'm a bit confused from the questions and why we cannot reverse something that is already, is just a growing bag that we can actually stamp out. Who is promoting these fertilizers from your end? Who is bringing them into this country? Who is saying longer 10 is better than my father's indigenous, maize? Who is saying I cannot get my matoke that has a sack and I put it back in? Do I have to go and buy another sucker that is as small as a nut to put it 2 meters down with cow dung? Thank you very much. See you.
But can you clarify, you said I'm promoting which agenda? Or did I misunderstand you? Did you say I'm promoting some agenda?
No, Professor, I'm asking from your ministry, from where you're coming from. Why don't we have stopgaps? Why don't we have somebody stopping this?
So I think if I could I think where you left off is where I think we'll just jump into the feedback. I have to confess that I come to this debate with a very biased mindset, a biased mindset on the fact that I agree with you. I think the biggest challenge that we're discussing here, balancing Africa's development needs and a sustainable future, it's in many ways to Africa's, we're being asked that it should be at our cost. Somehow we need to compromise in a way that we are not even the ones defining what that compromise should be. And I think that's what the lady is saying. I think, can we be the ones actually leading the discussion on what those stopgap measures should be in terms of how do we actually slow this down? And I think the student from UCU mentioned, like, for example, why is we're talking about foreign laws, for example, within local jurisdiction, dictating how we shape our policy. It goes back to my question to both of you about our capacity. What capacity do we really have to deal with this? Can we really chart out development on our own terms in a way that we are able to also, not in our own terms because we are part of a global community and we recognize climate change is an issue, but can it be in a way that we are actually influenced? Do we have influence? So there's a number of questions, mostly to you, Professor, but I think all of them, Arthur, also they touch on some of the things you've talked about. So, and the element, the issue of consumption and other factors, including social and population pressures that are affecting this discussion. So, Professor, we will start with you. If you could go through the series of issues which were raised, and then we can bring in Arthur. If we still have another 5 minutes, then we'll give you a chance.
So I I'll start with the last. I'm not sure if I got the name. Is it Anna Kakozaya? It's an interesting one, and I'm reluctant to go into the details because it's pregnant with so many issues that I don't wish to unravel or open. But if you take the direction of Awel that he has been trying to pursue, so who is pushing the agenda? There is an invisible or visible person. But there are things which are also clear. If you go to Europe, for example, you'll see that issues of organic, issues of green growth or whatever, they are more embedded in their systems and policy, and they propel that. It's not news. This is in the open domain. If you go to the US, you understand how policy is driven. If it happens next month on 5th of November that it changes from, the Democrats to the Republicans, it will be a different conversation altogether. And those things permeate and, they sort of get to the lowest level. So on one hand, you can also argue that there is economics related to that. If you look at Uganda and its growth and its agriculture, and you're looking at the documents, it's indicating that 80% of the land is arable, isn't it? But only about 30% is being cultivated, and government wants to increase production and productivity. What's our target for coffee? We have always had these 20 million bags of coffee as a target for 2020. We failed to realize it. Now it has been pushed to, I think, 2030. The possibility of also realizing that is a bit there in the middle. Now, one can argue that if you want to increase production, then application of fertilizers is the easiest. You get it from there, you apply, you have your yields, you put things on the market. How many of you go to the market and you are asking whether your beans you're buying were organically grown without application of artificial fertilizers or not? There are not many. You have arguments also that if you are going to resolve or solve the issue of food security, then you first forget the others, first put food on the table, then you can have the luxury of asking other questions if somebody has an option. Okay, there are debates in that line. When you come to our system, I mean, even us at personal level, you want to grow your crops, but you want to have, at least that's the desire at my level, that if I'm cultivating some 5 acres, I'm putting them under cropping, I want to have some 4 cows on the farm that are supplying manure that I can use in, the crops without necessarily buying more fertilizer. It's a contextual issue. Do you have the capacity, when you sort of characterize your farmers, do they have the capacity to do that I'm desiring? You start now to look at the nutrient exports in a context. You go to a place like Bududa and Manafa, they are entirely zero grazing sort of systems because you just don't have the land. But then you can see the level of productivity. You still have landslides there and whatever, but in relative terms, and don't misquote me, you visualize the landscape, you see people moving with sacks of onions and the like, and it gives you some indicator about the quality of this land. Move away from there, Bududa Manafa, go to the other side of Erigon, Sironko, Bulambuli, you'll find people cultivating maize there. They are using fertilizers, a lot of fertilizers. We've done studies to try and look at how do you optimize crop residue within these systems. At the end of the season, you find the maize waste heaped and they are burning. After that, they are going to buy fertilizers. So there are lots of those things that sometimes work out even at a very small scale to understand what do you have to do. You may have seen on social media, I think 2 or 3 weeks where, what's the district? Is it in Mbarara? I'm forgetting properly, where now they are charging for every car that is living with manure, you have to pay a certain amount of money. It tells you that there is a recognition that you have to keep certain things in the system. But then those are scattered efforts here and there. How do you move a certain agenda to a reasonable scale that takes care of the peculiar issues within a specific community? Peculiar in terms of ecology, peculiar in terms of the people and capacities. You got some areas, you could look at available organic fertilizers and you analyze at the household level. They do not have capacity, labor-related issues. So it's a little bit of that complexity. For me as a person from academia, I'm very reluctant to answer a question of who drives the agenda. I'm more comfortable to look at it from an empirical situation point of view.
Thank you, Professor Arthur.
Yeah, okay. So, and then it comes...
in 1 minute, please, if we can.
In 1 minute, what do I answer? EU regulation, again, this is something that is coming. You can argue it from all angles. For now, the target is on coffee. That's what they have indicated. Other crops may come in later. People who are doing coke. But what's the bottom line here? It's deforestation. You can argue that you have failed to manage your systems. And if you go into economics, then the debate is there. Somebody is telling us, okay, if you want to tap into our markets, then you have to comply to A, B, C, and D. Does it have an ill intention? We can debate that. But there is also an angle from which you can benefit from it. For me, as a person from science and academia, the most important thing should come to do with which methodology are you using? Have you contextualized and understood our system? If I'm planting my trees to sequester carbon and the like, there is a time at which I may cut them in order to get money from those trees. So you have to look at it from all angles, discuss it, and find a better way in which to handle. They have given an extension of up to next year, but this thing has been around for like 4 years. I think started in 2020, if I remember properly. And then the reaction is coming.
And therein, that's where some of the challenges are. But Arthur, if you could please use this time to extensively respond, because we are closing.
Right. Thank you very much. I just want to say thanks to Muhammad, Dorcas, Esther, and Carol for the different questions, and James as well. I see that the questions, for instance, about green deforestation, Esther, your question on carbon offsetting, and the gentleman in the brown jacket there who was asking about whether we can bridge the gap with small farmers. All this can come together to say, yes, there's a possibility using market mechanisms to be able to centralize the sale of, for instance, emissions reductions. And then probably dwell on the question of James around the EU deforestation regulations that has been answered ably, especially about coffee. Different economies and continents want to protect themselves against certain things. They say, this particular problem, we don't want to internalize it for ourselves. And whether the circular economy can be helpful in combating climate change, yes, most definitely. If you think about it from the perspective of waste, if you see what has happened to our people in Chitezi, that's unfortunate. A circular economy solution to that would have been gasification of that waste, LPG, bottle it, use it to run buses, a bus rapid transit system in an urban area. All urban areas generate waste. All urban areas, therefore, are able to put fuel for their buses. But I would like to use the last minute or two to talk about the smartwatch question that James posed. And this is the question that we need to be very careful about. You know, it's not possible to live a zero carbon lifestyle in 2024 and 2025. I just came from Seoul the other day. I had been in Washington. I had been also in the maybe past 2 months or so. You will have traveled 3 or 4 times. You're not going to be able to do it on a motor, on a bicycle and have zero emissions related to your transport or your locomotion. Now, there are also other things that we need to be careful about and aware of. The element of advocacy, or you're cutting trees, or you're doing this, does not push the climate change agenda as much as the element of, since you're cutting trees, I shall plant a tree, I'll sell you my credit. That's what pushes the agenda. This is what Esther Awori is talking about when she talks about carbon offsetting. Now, in the specific sense of some of these choices that we make, so for instance, the alternative to clean cooking is using electricity. By show of hands, who here uses electricity to cook their food? So with the exception of the 5 people that I'm seeing here, everybody else, you're killing the planet by cooking food. Is that a logical statement for me to make? So you see, gas looks logical, but you see, gas is non-renewable. It's non-renewable gas. But the thing is, the alternative is that gas would have been flaring. So now you've trapped it and you're using it to cook. So it makes it less problematic. You see this sort of question. So let us assume that if my food relates to 3 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent per year, but when I use gas, I am using maybe 2.5 tons of carbon dioxide per year. Of course, an open fire, 3-stone cook stove, that is 4 tons of carbon dioxide. It is very bad. But what if I planted my trees? You know, we need to always have a balance around this, because it's not possible to have a zero lifestyle carbon. And if I would say anything, especially to members of the public here who are interested in this subject, we need to think about the question of advocacy very seriously, and to refer very well to what Professor has said here on the utilization of methodologies. You will find that if you have gadgets and tools that are able to increase your ability to work. So for instance, it's true you talked about the fact that I have got a smartphone, I've got a computer, everybody has. But the fact that you have a computer means you don't have to drive to work. It means you probably can sit in your, so those are emissions related to diesel that you are offsetting. The fact that maybe you have a smartwatch, you can be able to do your run at home and track and say, I've run 12 miles, you're putting something on your health budget. A sick person is very costly for an economy like ours. If I sit in an ambulance and I'm coming from anywhere that feeds onto the Northern Bypass, everybody here probably came from somewhere off the Northern Bypass other than a university hall. You will see how long it is for an ambulance to get to Mulago. The cost of handling a funeral far exceeds the cost of running some of these things. And if I'm to comment, don't be victimized by the lack of specific knowledge. The amount of electricity that we use, for instance, in this hall is a lot. But electricity in Uganda, at least on the national grid, has very little emissions related to it because it is hydroelectric power. So someone will come here and they are what we call tone policing, climate policing. They are using all sorts of language to say, oh, you people are consuming electricity and so on, but this is for the greater good. And in any case, where we are plugging it off is hydroelectric power. In other countries, I don't want to mention a specific country because some of these are donor countries to our countries. When they use electric vehicles, the vehicles are actually on diesel-run generators. So you see, the national grid has diesel. which is powering the grid. Yes? And then you're using an electric vehicle. So this means you're using diesel to power a vehicle. But all these are sort of nuances that need to be thought of. And I would like to thank all those who were able to ask these questions, Muhammad, James, Dorcas, Esther, and Carol, because they all come around this element of circular economy, this element of lifestyle choices, this element of packaging, these small. So for instance, the smallholder farmer you talked about of 2.5 hectares, that smallholder farmer can probably benefit from a tree growing scheme, a carbon development scheme, and when we aggregate that, we have the benefit of numbers. Thank you so much.
Great. So let's give him a hand. Yeah. So this was such a good discussion, a very complex discussion that like I said, I'm no climate expert, but I'm passionate about development and the future of the continent and the place of Africa in the world. I think that's a really important context to, even when you don't understand some of the technical languages we're listening to, it's just understanding Africa's place in the world. And I think this is where this discussion is sort of situated. The fact that, for example, in the next, I was just reading statistics the other day, and they said in the next like 30 years, almost like 5 out of 10 people around the world they're going to be African. You know, our population is growing at such a high rate, but also the opportunities are not growing at anywhere close to the rate the population is growing. I think we keep seeing these images of young people drowning in the Mediterranean Sea, trying to cross into Europe to find opportunities. But we also see like famine in, we have the biggest chunk of arable land in the world, but we still have so many of our people dying of hunger every day. We see all these landslides and refugees and all these things. So these are all these are real issues for our countries, for Africa to deal with within the context of the world. But in terms of, again, as Professor said, all these things are decided by political power, by governments. And we still have, whether we don't like to, I don't want, as Professor, you say us and them, but we are still not in a position to sort of like force agendas which are actually more favorable to us. So I think we have to be more intentional, but I think also the counterparts within the world, within this conversation, like Arthur said, developing countries, Africa included, we are the guarantors of the future of the world. We will guarantee the future of the world, including like Brazil and South America, and all these are different countries. Because should we also choose to be as destructive as the other economies developed, then the world won't be as we imagine. Our children will not be able to inherit the sort of world that we have lived in. So thank you, everybody, and thanks for the conversation. Thanks for the very interesting, questions, and thanks to the panel. Thank you so much, Professor, for making time. Thank you, Arthur, for making time off your schedule. Yeah. Thank you, and I give back to the moderator.
No, I think Awel and the panel deserve a much bigger a round of applause than that. Wow, it was such an interesting one. I wish we had much more time together. But I saw some lies, especially at the point in time that Arthur asked about how many people cook using electricity. Some decided to raise your hands up just because you knew the next one was going to be a bang, reminding you of how we are destroying the environment. But I love the context in which Arthur brought in the conversation of the fact that, yes, we may be thinking about climate change, but the reality of living a zero-emission life may be very hard. But how do we get to offset? How do we get to balance? And I think that is the biggest conversation that would be coming through at that, and it is very important. I love the conversation because I am a farmer. I love the conversation about fertilizers, but also the discussion that Professor did bring in. We need to learn to keep some things in particular places. We need to learn to, back in the day, there was always, I think, the paddocking system, whereby, you know, I am going to plant here after a specific period of time. I will not be able to utilize that. Let me move to another one, and then I'll come back. What happened to that? what happened to that kind of agriculture whereby I will slash all the waste, leave it in to decompose, and then I can be able to plant. We think, clear everything, burn the bush, and then you can be able to buy the fertilizer and dump it right there. So I think this panel has brought to us the whole idea of having to rethink the way we do things and what we choose to adopt. Who is promoting? I also will not get into that conversation, like Professor clearly did say. We want to get on to our next conversation. And this one is going to be talking about the bloody stalemate and what lies ahead for Sudan amidst a myriad of failed interventions. Just the other day, there was another, ceasefire that was dishonored. And earlier in the morning, I think some of the speakers did talk about the fact that because we've had a lot happening in different areas, you're now talking about the Gaza. It feels like South Sudan, it feels like Sudan, I beg your pardon, Sudan is forgotten, and yet there is still a conflict right there that we need to pay attention to. Up until we get a definite solution, we will not stop talking about what is happening there. And like it was said earlier on, when a conflict breaks out, it stops being just a conversation between two warring parties. It goes beyond there to the neighboring countries, to the parties that are involved. And for Uganda's case, of course, we get to speak about how many of the people are in here out of their own will. They wouldn't have wanted to be called refugees, but here they are. They're looking for safety. They're looking for a place to be better. But what are we doing as neighbors? What are we doing as the world to ensure that whatever is happening there, the impunity that is going on can actually be curbed? And that is why we're going to be getting this particular conversation at this point in time. And allow me invite the moderator for this panel. That will also be the very last panel closing of our conversation. Because the next three panels will be coming through at a later stage, and that will be tomorrow. But before I invite my moderator, I am going to request once again that we stand up. The afternoon sessions, even while in class, the teachers here know. The afternoon sessions are those where you have to literally keep reminding people, are you awake? Are you listening to me? Are we together? And then you have no answers with regard to yes. So I just want you to move 1, 2, 3 steps away from where you are. I know you have a bit of space next to you. So 1, 2, 3 steps away from where you are as you stretch out as well. Very, very important. We take these things as simple up until you really have to live that particular kind of life. So just stretch out, swing to your left, to your right. I want your neck stretched out a little bit because we are having another energetic panel, and it's going to be the very last panel for the day. So I want us to be as lively as we were when we were starting off the conversation in the morning. This is as Stephen gets ready to come and take on this conversation. So when we have all the name tags ready, I will be inviting Stephen to come and take on this conversation. All right. Are we done with that? So I can invite my speaker. Okay, thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. And so, ladies and gentlemen, to take on this conversation, allow me invite the director, Conrad Adenauer Stiftung, Country Office from Egypt. Let me invite Stephen Kruger to come and take on this conversation. And I would request that the same manner of enthusiasm that we've been having since morning is the same that we get to exhibit as we have a very final one for today. been having. And the reason why we're going to be having 2 art pieces is because we've had 3 different conversations since morning. This is going to be the 3rd one, and tomorrow it's going to be the same. So these paintings are going to reflect exactly the kind of conversations that we were having, and on stage I think you can clearly see that. So while we're at it doing the discussion, the painter will be at it as well, exercising their craft and art and exercising their talent right there. But ladies and gentlemen, let's give a round of applause to Stephen as he comes to take on this next conversation. Are we together? You know, afternoon sessions have to be like that. Okay, Stephen, please come through.
Hello, good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for the invitation. My name is Steffen Krüger. I am the director of the country project in Egypt from the Konrad Adenauer Foundation, and we are also covering and working on Sudan together with my colleague Niels Wörmer. Yes, please, I know it's raining and we are a little early, but it is good to saving us some time. I would like to invite the panelists to the stage, and I would like to start with Ambassador Dr. Angkok James Solomon Padiet from South Sudan. He's a professor of political science at the University of Juba. He's a diplomat and renowned political analyst, commentator, and columnist in South Sudan. Secondly, I would like to invite Mr. Moses Crispus Okello, senior researcher at the Horn of Africa Institute, which I had the pleasure to visit last week. Please, Mr. Okello. And last but not least, Mr. Khaled Cyril Katem, development studies expert and political observer of the Horn of Africa, based in Djibouti, working for GIZ. So, while the panelists have taken their space, I would say we are following the discussions or the model of discussions as we did previously. So we have beginning statements. We will have a couple of questions here up on the stage. And then I would like also to invite you to ask your questions, as this is also an important discussion coming up. A bloody stalemate, what lies ahead for Sudan amidst a myriad of failed intervention. So a very specific questions dealing with a very problematic and long-term conflict we are experiencing right now in this region. To take up some points from the previous discussions, which can lead to our discussion, is, of course, this is a conference to exchange information and getting some insights, but it's also a possibility for advocacy and making a stand. So you will get also to the case of what Uganda can do, but we let me start also to get to this described gap of Mr. Arvel, the previous moderator, where there is potential and there's the reality, and unfortunately in Sudan right now this is a very large gap, and of course you know of all this. The Sudan conflict has already taken lives of 10,000s of people. There is, of course, the internal or national component, which is like internal displaced population, which is, according to the United Nations organization, one of the largest right now, 6.5 million people. About half of the Sudanese population are in need of humanitarian assistance, according to OCHA. But it has also a very large international component. We have refugees, almost 2 million now in different African countries. We have all those international powers and foreign military support. We have a dimension of international crime. So it is a multiple crisis, And it is, as mentioned before, also by our main moderator, overshadowed by the crisis or the war in the Ukraine, but also in the Middle East. So let's get into this topic. And I would like to ask, in a first round of question, maybe 5 to 10 minutes maximum, what is your current standpoint and your analysis of this conflict? And in particular, as you come from very different organizations and different regional areas on the conflict in Sudan. And I would like to ask Ambassador Dr. Hancock to please start our conversation. I will join you, and then we go the round. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's my pleasure to be back here to Makerere after 20 years. I came here when I was doing my master's from University of Nairobi. We visited this campus, and we spent some time here, a week. And I didn't step here again until after 20 years from now. So it's my pleasure. The issue of the stalemate of the war that is ongoing in Sudan is a very alarming situation to the world. Unfortunately, not to Africa, by the way. Is the Europe and maybe US is more concerned about that war than Africa. And it is a war that is refusing to go away because the military men who are fighting, they don't believe in peace talks. And if they were fighting among themselves alone, it could have been less destructive. But they are fighting among the civilians. And it's a strange war because it's not the first war in Sudan, because since 1881, Sudan has been fighting with the colonialists, the Mahdi's revolution, we know it. But again, when it became independent in 1956, it's only 4 years later then it went into civil war. But it was a war of rebellion versus the government. And most of it was fought in southern part of the Sudan, which has become the Republic of South Sudan now. The strange thing about this war is a war in the capital city. So it is not a war of government versus rebellion. It is a war of the government itself in the capital city. Like Kampala here, war break out and everybody runs away. And you think that you will come back maybe the next day, but you find yourself, it is over a year, you are not going back. The government has to run away from its capital seat and relocate it to somewhere else, from Khartoum to Port Sudan, and again from Port Sudan, because again another war is almost breaking up there, they have to relocate to another area called Atbara. And we don't know from Atbara where it will be relocated. So it is a very strange war that is amusing those who have studied war, because it's not common the way it is being run. And peace initiatives have been tried since the time the war broke out last year, 2023. But so far, nothing is bearing fruit. And the reason that nothing is bearing fruits is that the very military don't believe in peace talks. Those who are running the war, they believe in victory. And because of that, I think the common civilian have decided to move on with their life. Either you run away from the territory where the fighting is taking place, starting from the capital city and the other cities, or you stay there and find better means of livelihood. For example, in Khartoum, the production has come to a standstill. The industries have stopped. But because it is a very big city, it can sustain whoever can break into the neighbor house and take things to survive on. And when your neighbor things get finished and he or she has run away, then you go to the next who has run away and you survive. So now 1 year, people are surviving in that manner. But these things are running out because there is no replacement. It's only consumption of what is available for survival. Now, as things are running out and people are running away, it is creating a very big humanitarian crisis in the world and the burdens on the donor countries. So that's why they have tried their best through a number of initiatives which did not work. One of them is called the Quad, is led by US, and then you have the Middle East, Saudi Arabia, Emirates, and UK. Almost they are going for a year, there's nothing coming out from that. Although the delegates have accepted to go to Jeddah in Saudi Arabia, but it has become a tour with no results of a peace agreement. Even a humanitarian corridor agreement is not being respected, which was signed in that forum. The trilateral, which is run by the African Union, the UN, the IGAD, these are organizations known for peace mediation, but it seems the situation of Sudan has beaten them so far. They couldn't strike any peace deal. The IGAD quartet, IGAD was pivotal in mediating the peace between the SPLM, SPLA, and then the Sudan government by then, and it succeeded. And South Sudan became an independent as a result of that. This time around, they failed. They couldn't manage to do anything in the case of Sudan. The neighboring countries, led by Egypt, also tried to come up with an initiative. They have been meeting in N'Djamena and in Cairo, but so far the year is running out. Nothing is coming out from this. The eminent personalities, at the lead of whom is Thabo Mbeki from South Africa, who was very connected to Sudan, also did not succeed up to now. Juba, which people thought as a leverage on Khartoum because of the oil flow, is even getting scared because its oil is even getting shut up. And the flow is no longer there. So it's becoming even biting on Juba instead of having a leverage. Kampala here with Uncle Museveni has been trying to bring these military leaders to Entebbe here if they could walk from the airport just there. But one of them refused to come. That is the man leading the Sudan Armed Forces. He has some condition for him to come here. So this initiative is not picking any pace. And Geneva was the last, where US plus European and Emirates tried also to come in to use external influence. But up to now, we are in October. They started in August. September has gone, and there is nothing. So you can call it a bloody stalemate. You can see it, how it is. Whatever an attempt you try to bring peace, it is a failure. So what next? What is the future then?
Oh, Mr. Ambassador?
Yes.
Yes. Before you come to the future, let's stay in the present, and I would like to ask the other panelists as well. Mr. Okele, you are a researcher. You have been at AUC in Cairo. Ambassador Ankon already mentioned international endeavors to find peace, or like to negotiate for peace. Can you give your standpoint, but also maybe talk also about external actors who are present in Sudan right now or interfere in this conflict? No, Mr.
Thank you very much. I would like to start by thanking CAS for inviting me to this conversation. It's certainly a conversation which has been which I've been thinking about for close to 25 years now. Even if the conflict about which we speak only started a year ago. As Ambassador said, this is a conflict which is on the lips of practically every other entity that is observing events in Uganda. So it's in Sudan. So it's something that is very important. So I would just like to throw in my bit by answering at least 4 questions. The first of which is, how did this whole thing start? And I'm not going to go into detail. Just I would like to mention that there are 2 at least precursor events that we might want to pay attention to in trying to understand how we got where we are. The first of which being the last maneuvers that President al-Bashir performed in just before he left power. The changes in government and the construction within the Sovereign Council. And I would like to urge you that what you see as the military unit that failed to hold the country is a product of that maneuver. So that's one of the issues. Secondly, obviously, is a deadlock between the military and the civilians, and that deadlock is very well understood. So that's the first issue. The second issue, where are we now? Where do I see it from where I sit? Certainly, and as Ambassador has said, we've got a deadlock at the moment, but it's a deadlock characterized by loss and acquisition of territory, within Khartoum and also in other parts of the country. And that deadlock appears to be tending towards the fragmentation of Khartoum, of Sudan. It would appear as though at this point in time, the RSF are very comfortable with the part of Sudan that they have. They're saying the south, you can as well stay in Port Sudan. We're fine with that. So that's the general trajectory that we see this going. And why do I say that? It's very clear to us that the RSF at the moment is starting to behave like a government. We are aware that they are heavily recruiting, reinforcing their military structures, and that's a very concerning issue. We are also aware that they're setting up civilian administration in their areas of control, and that's only the behavior of an entity that is contemplating governance. The third one, and most unusual, is that a few days ago, they also made the very first foreign affairs statement that any entity could take. And what do I mean by that? For those of you who are following this, you would want to recall that RSF warned Egypt and also barred Egyptian commodities from coming into its territory. Now, you don't speak like that unless you have a certain control of territory and can guarantee the entry and exit of particular goods. That is the behavior of somebody that's looking forward to managing a particular type of territory. That's the second question. Third question, why is it difficult to solve? The ambassador again hinted at this, but I would like to just identify at least the religious component of this, which we tend to forget in this conflict. The fact that within both the SAF and the RSF, you've got the Muslim Brotherhood and the NCP, who are controlling those entities and perhaps creating the sort of tensions within those entities and the difficulty to resolve the conflict that we've seen. That's a very important one. The second one, your question about the external actors, again, not going into depth, but there is a network, a complicated network of external actors that is involved in this conflict. I mean, sometimes it gives a bit of a headache trying to disentangle who is doing what and who is associated with what, and that's making the entire process of resolution difficult. This is partly the reason, as Ambassador said, the likes of IGAD have found it challenging to respond to this situation. First, by obviously the Ruto process that you mentioned. The IGAD now has Korbandi as the envoy, the Committee of the Five, which is the latest entity involved in trying to resolve this. You might want to remember that the Committee of the Five is an AU mechanism alongside the high-level panel, which are all are trying to address this. And from the last time I knew, they were supposed to be meeting in Kampala today. I don't know, whoever has better information should update us on that. So just two last things, just to wind up this section of my interventions. I think with Sudan we are seeing a slow but progressive trend towards a Somali-like situation. And this is a situation that is absolutely worrying to everybody involved and should be addressed as soon as we can. And the second is that barring some kind of black swan, some kind of divine intervention, I think all the indicators that we see in Sudan suggest that this conflict is going to be protracted for an extremely long period of time. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you very much. Mr. Khalid, can you also shed some light on?
Yes, thank you very much. Usually when shedding light on the situation in Sudan, I tend to first try to take the picture of what's happening or how it started in Sudan and bring it to audiences who may not be really familiar with the situation in Sudan. But I want you to imagine if Khartoum was Kampala. Usually as Africans, we are used to rebel forces and militias being at the borders or at the outskirts of a city trying to approach a capital from the outside in. In the case of Sudan, it was the complete opposite. The war started in the very center of Khartoum. So imagine a war starting right across the street from your house. That's where the war started for us. And that means that we immediately started feeling the repercussions of being in a state of war. The RSF militia initiated. The army has the air force, so they control the sky. The RSF controlled the ground. The army bombed the RSF barracks and locations, and what did the RSF do naturally? They spread into the residential neighborhoods. At first, we thought that this was a case of barricading themselves behind the human shields to protect themselves from the onslaught by the Air Force. But after a week, the looting started, the attack on civilians started, the rape started, and the gradual actions that led to the displacement of 10 million Sudanese started. So it's the largest displacement crisis in the world currently, as far as I know. Unfortunately, The war started with the militia taking over the entire capital. And you have to keep in mind that this militia, at its roots, is an ethnic militia. Although it tried to portray itself as a national militia, but it's an ethnic militia formed from a core of 6 main tribes from the Arabs of Darfur. And this became evident now, 18 months after the war. Because when the militia started the war, the first rhetoric that they had was that they are fighting for democratic transition, to push the process of democratic transition. But then they started committing human rights violations, so that messaging didn't hold up anymore. They switched to a new message that they are fighting the Sudan of 1956. 1956 is the year of independence, and it's used to signify the state, the post-colonial state of the Khartoum elites that is centralizing the rule and hoarding all of the resources of the country. But that didn't hold up because they started massacring the other tribes in Africa, in Darfur, the African Masalit tribes, who are also marginalized people, and the 1956 rhetoric did not hold up. Now the last rhetoric that they are using, that they're currently resorting for, is the most honest messaging that they ever had during the war, that this is a war of their ethnicity, their tribe, against the oppressing Northerners. Northerners for them is just a keyword for everyone else. And and probably this was prompted by the new developments on the ground, because the army up till the 26th of September, almost 1 month ago, was always in a defensive position in their barracks, fighting off the advances of the RSF, who have been rapidly expanding across the country, although overtly they were claiming that they want to go to peace talks. But at the same time, they were spreading all across the country. So, in the 26th of September, the army switched its position. They started crossing bridges and taking up strategic roads and moving into locations that were controlled by the RSF. It's a slow process, but it seems to be gradually improving. And the most recent development is that the leaders of the RSF in some locations that are not affiliated to the tribal base of the militia started to break away from the militia. So something tells you that the crack is happening, and internationally things are starting to change as well. Facebook and Twitter started banning the platforms of the militia, which is a major breakthrough because the militia really relied on the media and psychological warfare in their war. Some people say that, well, someone I was discussing these notes before I came says, you almost sound like you're radicalized against the militia. This is for one reason. I have no political affiliation, but the militia currently is in my house. And I see some Sudanese faces here in the audience, and I'm sure that if their house is in the militia controlled areas, they cannot go back to their houses. So the war that the militia waged at the beginning was against the government, but later on it went against the civilian infrastructure. The numbers speak for themselves in Sudan. We mentioned that we have the largest displacement in the world. The last number from the IOM was 10.5 million. In some reports, 12.5 million. That's more than the population of a lot of countries. The death toll, there's a debate about it. The UN says 20,000, the USA says 150,000, and we're yet to see the ratio of combatants to non-combatants on that death toll. That we will only know when the war ends. You have 25 million people facing acute hunger, and you have 700,000 people facing famine. 80% of the health sector is out of service. There was a methodical targeting of medical institutions by the militia. The areas that are not in their control are usually shelled from beyond. And there was a case where the army and civil society organizations rehabilitated one of the maternity hospitals in Omdurman and published the pictures of the reopened wards and the new paint job and everything. The next day, the militia shelled that hospital again. So this is systematic. Since we mentioned famine and acute hunger, I must mention the valiant effort of the Sudanese civil society organization who were on, well, there goes my name. So the civil society organizations succeeded in providing food to many people who otherwise would have died of hunger, especially in the areas that are besieged by the militia and where the access to food is blocked and controlled by the militia. So they were on the shortlist for the Nobel Peace Prize. And yeah, that was some valiant effort and shows you that even in the darkest time, African civil society organizations can really make a difference on the ground. Do we talk about the future or we leave it for the...
No, not yet.
All right, okay. So yeah.
So, thank you. And if I could stick with you for one more question. So there's an estimation that the Sudanese economy is losing about $15 billion. You already mentioned that agricultural land, and by Sudan is one of the largest, or used to be one of the largest agricultural producing countries. What about the other industry? And I mean, I remember reading also that Sudan had, for example, a large military industry as well. So can you talk a little bit about like what is in the economy, what is still working and what not?
Yes, that's a good question. The ambassador mentioned that the industrial base of Sudan is in Khartoum, and the military production also is in the area of Khartoum. And unfortunately, all of that fell in the hands of the RSF at the first day of the war. You need to remember that this militia was, for a period, used by the government in securing strategic locations. So naturally, when the war started, they were positioned in a favorable position to take over everything, including the military industrial complex. One thing to remember is that the second state that the militia took over after Khartoum is Jazeera State. And Jazeera State is the agricultural heartland of Sudan, and they completely stopped and suspended and made it difficult to continue agriculture for all scales of farmers. They robbed and looted all of the means of production. Tractors and even machinery from the production line of decrepit sugar factories in Jazeera were ripped out and transported to Darfur. What do you take a tractor to Darfur for? It's not functional in the terrain in Darfur. But it seems like that was systematic and that was the instruction. They're trying to displace people. And testament to that is that whenever they displace people, they bring people from their location in Darfur and settle them in the houses of the people that they displace. They try to impoverish people by taking away the means of production. They try to subjugate and humiliate people. The morning panel was talking about gender-based violence. The numbers that I'm reading are from OSHA and from the UNDP. 6.7 million women are facing gender-based violence in Sudan. And if you take the pinpoint map of the locations where those 6.7 million women are, and you transpose it on the map of Sudan, it matches exactly with the areas controlled by the RSF militia. The RSF militia and the independent commission, I veered away from the industry, but I feel that this is relevant to the morning session on gender-based violence. An independent commission, fact-finding mission, commissioned by the UN Human Rights High Commission, had the finding that both sides, the RSF and the Sudanese armed forces, have war crimes. That is understandable. Terrible, but understandable. Both have war crimes. But the RSF militia in particular have committed crimes against humanity. And I'm just going to read one line of the report, that the report also found reasonable grounds to believe that the RSF and its allied militias committed the additional war crimes of rape, sexual slavery, and pillage, as well as ordering the displacement of civilian populations and the recruitment of children below 15 in hostilities. Sexual slavery, that was a statement, taking women from areas where northerners, which, as I mentioned, represents everyone else, and taking them back to Darfur and selling them into sexual slavery and bragging about it. And you don't need a UN report to find out about this. The thing about the RSF is that most of their soldiers are millennials or younger. They're very active on TikTok about comparing who has more stomach for committing brutalities. I have seen videos that I cannot unsee. Most Sudanese have seen things that they cannot unsee. And with every video that you see of such atrocities committed by the RSF, a part of your soul dies. Yeah, so.
Okay. Staying with economy, the Republic of South Sudan, which has done a successful agreement, and however, your country now, Mr. Ambassador, is predominantly affected by the conflict, in particular exporting oil from South Sudan. Can you talk a little bit more about this and what does it mean for the South Sudan economy?
Yes. Again, I am also affected, like in my house is occupied in Khartoum because I used to be a diplomat there, so my house is also in Khartoum. But this does not take me away from being objective also to come to where things are. The Rapid Support Force, they have transformed from a militia. The narrative that they are a militia is not correct anymore. They were a militia, but they are no longer a militia because they have been legalized by the very government of Sudan, which they overthrow jointly with the Sudan Armed Forces. So it's only after they overthrow al-Bashir, who was indicted by ICC because of some of the problem of the beginning of this RSF, the Janjaweed, has caused Bashir the international criminality with ICC. So when they started the fight, they are no longer militia. They are part of the armed forces, but they have a special mission called Rapid Support Force. They are sent to places where they have to, like Swahili will say, arakaraka. They will do it quickly, and then now the army will come and take over to stabilize. So this is what they did in Khartoum. They did it very quickly and to everybody's surprise. And that's where the effect is beyond imagination. Now, South Sudan separated from Sudan. In one way or another, we are connected, we are one. And even after we separated, we used to divide the oil 50-50. And by then, the production was like 350. When we got separated, our production came down to 200 million barrels per day. So it means we had more oil than Sudan after we separated. But then because of succession issues, we have to continue supporting the economy of Sudan because it would have faced a lot of difficulty because they didn't do much of transformation in Khartoum when they were enjoying the oil even from South Sudan. They were diverting money for their own personal advantages, those who were in power. So they were surprised by the separation of South Sudan, and the whole economy of Sudan was collapsing. So the African Union, which was led by eminent personalities, and then the US, which was a strong ally of South Sudan, and the whole of IGAD, they convinced the new independent country that you support your brother, you don't need to abandon them. So that's why we continue paying what we call transitional financial arrangement. Almost closer to 4 billion. And that was coming from our oil. We were not sharing their oil, but we were the one giving them the oil. And the pipelines that carry that oil, it used to be owned by the Sudanese government in collaboration with the Chinese companies, which are also government companies. But after we got independent, they privatized the oil pipelines, and we continue paying the transit of our oil, in addition to the transitional financial arrangement. So we have been actually holding the economy of Sudan when it comes to the huge income from the oil. And we were also having our own. Even up to the time when war broke out in April last year, the oil was not touched by both warring parties because each of them was gaining. So until the RSF started to feel that they are not gaining, this is where they blocked the engineers to operate the station. And when the engineers were not there, the station stopped, and there was a blockage in the pipelines. And then one of the biggest pipelines that was carrying our oil stopped, and it really affected our economy in South Sudan terribly. And up to the extent that the government in Juba finds it very difficult up to now to pay even the civil servants, and even to cater for the basic services is becoming very difficult because of that blockage of the biggest oil. 70% or 90%, because it's 170 million barrels per day that got stopped. We just remain with something like 30 that's still flowing, and that is a very small quantity. So that has a direct effect on us because over 90% of the budget of South Sudan has been funded from that oil. So we're becoming victims the same way Sudan has also victimized itself because of the war. But then, in addition to this economic downturns on us, a number of displaced from that war have resorted to us. They have come running to South Sudan. So you can imagine again additional stress on South Sudan, and it's taxing on our economy also. But what we did is more or less like what Ugandan did. We welcome them as our brothers, and we allow them to work. If you are a doctor, you can go to any hospital and start treating patients. Nobody. If you are a professor, you go to the university. Like the University of Juba, we welcome back many professors who used to be teaching in the very university before we separated. Now they are professors there. In the market, you can open a shop, a mini supermarket, a big supermarket. You can get into real estate business, apartments. So that's what they're doing. So those who have money from Sudan, and particularly they were the one who messed up the Sudan. They are the one now investing this money in South Sudan, and some of them, I saw them in Uganda here, also investing their money. But they were the one who messed up the situation with a lot of corruption that they had on the oil money that used to flow very freely in all this. And using the army to control the politics. And that was the big blunder that Sudan has done, to politicize the army. And that is the consequence all of us are bearing now, and it is affecting us. Good enough, the government in Port Sudan have accepted to at least lower the condition they were giving for engineers not to travel to the RSF control areas, which are the passage of the pipeline of our oil. So they allow them, they have repaired the pipeline with the help of the Chinese, who are also stakeholders in these pipelines. And we're waiting for the resumption of the pumping of the oil through this pipeline anytime from this month. And we'll see how sustainable it will be. But we are not optimistic that it will be sustainable as long as the two generals and their forces are still busy with war. We think engineers will still run away, and the same blockage can still occur. So this is where we are. There is a promise that the oil will start to flow again. Then the 90% loss of our budget might start to come back. And even when it comes back, it can help us, and it can help also with mediation effort, because mediation needs money. Part of the reason we're not progressing in mediation, because we lack money. Even paying debts of the RSF leader, we have some debts with him. We are unable to pay, so he's angry with us in Juba. So if we have money and we pay his debts, I think, and Port Sudan is happy, things can flow. But if again that oil get blocked, we will run out of money, and then it will be a bit complicated, even to be a mediator without money. That is what we are afraid of. But we are seriously affected. The same way Sudan is affected, the same way South Sudan is really affected by this war. We feel that it is like our war in all this. The funny thing is that some of our young people are also involved in both sides. Some of them are with this Sudan Armed Forces because they used to be members of those forces before the separation. So they were recalled when they were running out of forces. The same thing with RSF also. Some of our young people are also fighting alongside with them because they don't want to come to South Sudan, so they feel comfortable somewhere there. At least if you can get something in a month through RSF or through this, and you are a young person, then you can fight and join any of them. So we are connected to both sides, and that's why also mediation is becoming very difficult. Because a mediator who is connected here and connected here, there's also a question mark whether you will not leak the information to this side or leak it to the other side. So that is the dilemma also South Sudan faces with that war, and we call it almost our war in that. So the solution to that war is a solution to a number of our problems in South Sudan. That's what we're thinking. The oil is the top, and it is connected with the Chinese companies, and sometimes they help us to contain the Sudan Armed Forces. When they want to take drastic decisions, the Chinese are the one who comes and tell them, relax, because it is affecting our companies as Chinese. So they also behave themselves and try to cooperate. The RSF are a bit difficult to deal with because sometimes the ground where they are, the chain of command sometimes is not very clear. So even when their leader is somewhere, somebody can take up orders from his own and goes and does something. So that's why we're not very optimistic, even when we have been assured that the oil flow will get back. And we hope there will be peace. That is all our hope. But how it will come, maybe that will be our last intervention, what the future holds. Let me stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. Mr. Okello, as we now are starting on mediation processes and what are the issues, you wrote in your recent article that the conflict is an overlapping of domestic and international struggles, but also that conflict parties have different preferences and are almost unable, as also Mr. Ambassador just mentioned, to negotiate. IGAD has failed, I'm quoting the ambassador, but also the Geneva negotiations. Where do you see how to break the circle of violence? Like, where do you see where's like an impact on finding a solution or bringing at least people on it at the table to negotiate or to begin a peace process?
I don't know why you gave me this one, but it feels as though you've given me the responsibility to find a solution to a rather complex and historical, a conflict about which there are many, different, interlocking, and sometimes divergent facets. As you mentioned, observing the behavior of the SAF, we, or at least from where we sit, do not foresee a Sudan led by a government which includes the SAF and the RSF sitting in one, capital. I mean, after all, that is the pre-war formula that failed to start with. So we do not foresee a return to that, in part because there are hardliners on both ends of this conflict. Hardliners in the South, in particular the Brotherhood, who just do not foresee themselves sharing power with the RSF, who they despise in many ways, and I've had all sorts of pejorative language used to describe them. On the other hand, you have a SAF which could, even if it had some Brotherhood components, which could contemplate a Sudan which is somewhat secular, assuming they get into power. They could contemplate that option. But a secular Sudan is not in the interest or even ideological foreboding of the SAF. So you've got very hardened positions there, which are extremely difficult to, to move and overcome. Just to disappoint my fellow panelists, the civil society component, the civilian component, unfortunately, could have done a bit of work in Khartoum, in particular the Resistance Committee. But what is now civil society, Sudanese civil society, which also happens to be in the diaspora, is a fragmented entity, first and foremost in the name of Tagadum, but also in the name of the democratic bloc, all of which are captured by different forces associated with these two primary entities. Now, the likes of Malika Garb, the other entities, could perhaps foresee a Sudan in which the SAF are in the picture. But they've got a historical problem with the RSF. So just how do you disentangle this kind of web? Do you go for two-party talks? Do you do three-party talks? Do you do quadrilateral talks? But do two-party talks? If you do multiple two-party talks, would that mean that the different two-party conversations would be saying eye to eye? That's extremely difficult. What we are hearing, which is somewhat unusual, is this connection between the different parties and Kampala. And for those folks who have been observing this conflict fairly closely, you have seen quite a bit of traffic between the RSF to Kampala and the SAF to Kampala, either by Burhan himself or by all manner of other emissaries. So we see that traffic, and I cannot say that I understand exactly what the traffic means, but certainly there's something in there that needs to be looked into in the search for solutions. We also see that Kampala has created a way out for, I would say, Tagadum by changing the dynamics. I remember in August when there were those conversations, the inter-Sudanese conversation in Addis Ababa, which failed to get an all-inclusive process. Kampala changed that dynamic by introducing some language in the mediation lexicon, this so-called most inclusive process. Now, this most inclusive idea, however, the components are, appears to be appealing to some elements in the conflict. So we see that that bit of affinity going on. And obviously, again, for those closely watching, this Committee of Five, the AU Committee of Five, that is meant to be intervening between the primary combatants, also seem to have some traction among certain parties. But above all, I think what would make the conversation more difficult is this network of actors. I mean, I don't foresee any solution, whether it's among Sudanese themselves. I do not foresee any solution that does not address the concerns of the UAE. I do not foresee any solution that does not address the concerns of Saudi Arabia. I do not foresee a solution that does not address the concerns of Iran. Iran is currently the primary supplier of SAF, as you will know. And I do not foresee a solution that takes into that does not take into account the interest of the various neighbors. So maybe a good place to start is to sort it out among the Sudanese themselves, but ultimately, whatever you do, there's an element of these outer rings of actors that will have to come into play, including, of course, what Ambassador just said. You've got the RSF literally squatting in Kafia Kingi, the oil, sort of a kingdom of South Sudan, if you wish. And so, there's a conversation that will have to be had around there. You've got remnants of the Fano from Ethiopia somehow involved in that in that conflict. Somehow you'll have to have a conversation, around these groups. And in a way, you will also have to deal with a trend which the RSF is itself an embodiment. This trend of having militia factions, several militia factions supporting government entities and then turning against them and becoming a problem of their nature. You will have to to address that dimension of the conflict. I mean, after all, the RSF itself revolted after a security sector process was being put together. So if you don't if you don't have guarantees for those different components of the different actors, I'm afraid you won't see much traction. How that comes about, I honestly don't know. Maybe something that happens across the Atlantic, whichever way it goes, we could provide a bit of leverage on the actors, but it looks like a big stick in one way or the other might need to be in the picture to help moderate some of the excesses.
Thank you. Mr. Khaled, civil society and various different actors in this conflict have been mentioned. No easy solutions. What is your take on Takatum and the political movement as kind of, I mean, aside from the two military or militia fractions, like is one of the actors in this who might provide the solution?
Well, the national political actors in Sudan, they are more or less in a very difficult situation. If they align, they feel that if they align with the army, they are aligning with the deep state that they have tried to overthrow in the 2019 revolution. If they align overtly with the militia, then they become associated with whatever atrocities the militia commits. So their current posture is stop the war, and they are hoping for, according to their description, an equilibrium of weakness happening between the two sides, and both having fatigue from the war and somehow ceding power to the political forces. And I doubt that that can be a quick fix or even a long-term solution. I just don't see it happening. I kind of disagree with them on that approach. So they can be part of a peace process, but the current posture isn't pushing towards a quick resolution to the conflict.
Mr. Ambassador, and then I will also open the floor to questions from the audience. The title of this panel is called "A Bloody Stalemate," which implies none of the military side is going to win or is going to dominate in the near future and maybe also in a long-term future. What are your scenarios on Sudan, and how do you see what might happen in the next years coming?
Yes, what the future holds in this bloody stalemate. Let me pick it from our experience in South Sudan and from the SPLM. When the SPLM divided among themselves in the bush in 1991, it was very hard to reconcile them until we got a bully. And a bully was the US. It forced them to negotiate peace, even if they do not like each other. They have to unify their stance and pursue the right to self-determination together. These were the military fighting among themselves. These are South Sudanese. We call them the SPLM leaders. Now, the conflict in Sudan is the same. You have also the military leaders who were groomed by the parties. They were either groomed by the Islamists or by the communists. These were the history of them. So, and most of them who were put in the military college were the children of the elites, either the elites of the parties. So when they were in the military, they had always the test of power. They would like to overthrow even their own fathers and become the government. So that has been the trend in Sudan. Most of military coups were done by the very sons of the political parties' leaders who were taken to the army to protect them. So it's more or less the same thing. What brought the element of RSF is because, for example, Bashir did not trust the army because he was part of them, and he knew one day they will overthrow him because they are their sons and nieces and whatever who lead that army. And they are not fully professional in their line of remaining in the army. They will always like to shift to politics and become the presidents of the country. So he knew that he will be overthrown. So that's why he abandoned this SAF, armed forces, not to trust them, and bring the militia who has nothing to do with the military college and put them to protect Khartoum and protect him as Bashir because he thought that they will not overthrow him. But later when the very militia got transformed and they knew how army operate, they colluded and then they overthrow al-Bashir. And Bashir is gone, and when they remain again, they fought among themselves and divided into two. So now, such kind of military leaders, you will not reconcile them. From our experience, once the military leaders differ, there is no reconciliation. They will never trust themselves again. So what do? You find a common ground that can bring them together, but you bully them on that common ground. And the bully now that we see, it will not be like a US alone, the way it was done to South Sudan. The bully could be the Middle East and also Africa, because Sudan is a duality. They are not fully African and they are not fully Arab. So they are just, sometimes they say we are Arab, sometimes they say we are African. So you need a bully from both sides. Get a bully from the Arab countries, because they will not trust US. US is an enemy to them because of the connection that they had with those of Osama bin Laden. You know, Khartoum has connection with them. So they cannot trust US. So it's only the African side and then the Middle East side where they think they are Arabs, and the African side where they think they are African. So if you get a bully from the Middle East, we don't know whether it will be Egypt who could play the role of the bully, but Egypt has taken side with the SAF more than the RSF. That's why it's becoming difficult for it to bully both sides. They can bully RSF, but they will not bully SAF. So this is disqualifying Egypt from being a good bully. Now you need to find who is neutral bully from the Arab world, bring them to the scene, and get a bully from Africa. It could be Museveni in Uganda here. Yes. And, or it could be Ruto in Kenya. Combine them and let them go and talk tough with each of these military men and tell them, by this time, if you do not do this, these are the consequences. That's it. I remember Colin Paul has to put John Garang with Usman Tha in a room and say, bring a pistol, put it here. Lock the room and say, you have to sign this tonight. You want to console, here is the Soraya phone. Call whoever you want to call inside the room when it is locked. Until midnight, no going out. And they have to sign what they call the Machakos Protocol, using that bullying. So you need to bring Al-Burhan. If they do not get to one place, you go to where one of them can go and you bully him in that place and say this is the consequence. The same with Hamdan Doglo. Also bully them and give them limit of time, that by this time peace must prevail and you sign something whether you like it or not. War has to stop. And after that, the rest of the civil society that are disintegrated, the rest of the political parties that has nothing to do with the armed wings, they can start to talk and come up with the transition. But if you do not bully and force the military to come to a common ground of stopping the war and making a peace which they will not like each other, but it is a peace that is forced on their throat, it's very difficult to move on. So this is from our experience in South Sudan. Our peace came through bullying. It was not a very sweet negotiation, by the way. Thank you.
Mr. Khaled, you wanted to add to the military question?
With regards to the militia part of it, the ambassador is right. The RSF used to be the Janjaweed militia. Then they were organized by Bashir as the Rapid Support Forces. And Rapid Support Forces, as Ambassador mentioned, because they rapidly address issues, but they are a support force for the army. And once the war started, the Sovereignty Council revoked the legal status of them, which then relegated them again back to being a militia. But at the same time, their behavior resembles the behavior of a militia. The recruitment is with no training at all. Just jump on the pickup truck and you get your uniform, which is a hallmark of a militia. And as mentioned, the chain of command at lower levels is not clear. There's no clear chain of command, which also represents the code of conduct of a militia. So if it looks like a duck and walks like a duck, objectively, probably it's a duck. So that is with regards to the RSF. As a solution, I also agree with the other panelists. There needs to be some pressure from outside interest into reaching a peace that will represent something that is a little bit palatable to the 12.5 million people that have been displaced, primarily, and to the interest of the stakeholders, the regional stakeholders in Sudan at the same time. So that is where the leeway for compromise is. Obviously, if you go against the interest of regional powers, you will go into a protracted war. So we need to accommodate that. We have to look into the environment around us and see what needs to happen. But what's delaying going to negotiations now is that place yourself in the place of Burhan as the president of the official institution of the state. If you go to a negotiation with the RSF while you have lost the capital and the agricultural heartland of the country, and a larger percentage of the population and the area is out of your hand, you're going to negotiation at a very weak position. The compromises you will need to make are completely unacceptable to most of the population. So I see that the time for negotiations will come, but it will come after the army progresses again on the ground and improves its position, and will negotiate in the direction of power sharing is not an option anymore. Going back to the pre-war power sharing arrangement is not an option for one reason, because that will be a formula for another war starting again very soon. What investor would invest money in Sudan with both those generals or both those institutions at the helm of power? Something needs to be happen. In the best scenario, maybe this is wishful thinking, that the army achieves great victory, retrieves the land that it reclaims the land that it has lost, mainly the capital and Jazeera State and Sinjar. If the militia rolls back into Darfur, then there will be another question. Do you negotiate with them with the option of disarmament and reintegration, which was the initial cause, the trigger behind the war? Or does the discussion of the taboo issue of secession come to the table? And that discussion is there in the Sudanese public debate now. If a certain region is coming at the center of the country with those kind of grudges and committing those atrocities, then there is a reasonable question of, is the union sustainable? But that's a discussion for another day.
Yeah, thank you very much. We will need the microphones now for the audience. Oh, okay. There's a few questions. So we had the concept of a bully, a very positive concept, which I hear for the first time, which is great. And I remember ECOWAS in West Africa tried to do that role, which has not worked. So let's go back to the audience. Please, if we can start on my left, on my right. And there was one arm very early on, the lady all the way up. She was asking the first question, and then we go to the gentleman in the pink shirt, and then further down.
Is this on?
And we collect questions, please. And address your questions to the panelists, please.
Thank you for this discussion. My name is Rebecca Glade. I am a historian of Sudan and a long-term resident of Sudan. I lived there for 12 years and left with the war. And I was struck in this conversation so far by a relative lack of positioning of the war and the politics of the outbreak of war in what preceded it. There was maybe 1-2 references to Bashir, one maybe total about the revolution, which occurred began in December 2018. And I think that's a pretty serious silence particularly because many of these issues that we are pointing to and that are being discussed stem from a crisis of hegemonic legitimacy that took place following the December Revolution. And I'm also struck when I'm thinking about this, and I'm sorry, this is a long build-up to the question, by this title and framing of this event. We're calling this a bloody stalemate and talking about the role of external actors. And I was thinking about it a lot because in many ways, the situation politically in Sudan following the 2021 military coup undertaken by the army and the RSF together created its own stalemate in which civilian forces, which were an uncomfortable umbrella that included resistance committees, as well as old school political parties in the Forces of Freedom and Change, were aligned against the security apparatus, including the army and the RSF. And in that moment, during that particular stalemate, the international community, by whom I mean Europe and the US, were pushing negotiation and compromise and saying that civilians were obligated to make a compromise with the security apparatus. That it was reasonable to want civilian-led government, but civilian government was a step too far. And this stalemate lasted from 2021 till the outbreak of war, when the security apparatus, in turn, turned on itself rather than make political concessions to civilians as a whole. Now we have a stalemate of a different sort during a war in which the international community is again pushing compromise, this time elevating certain members of civilian forces, the Forces of Freedom and Change, or portions of them being part of a new bloc called Taqaddum, while simultaneously pushing for a political negotiation between armed parties that largely does not involve other aspects of civilian life. So
Can I ask you for the question, please?
Yes, I've finished the framing now. So when we're thinking about this, how do you see intervention as such as driving change in this, and what drivers of change should be those that would affect this particular political moment? And how do you see the sort of crisis of legitimacy for both the RSF and the army as affecting this situation? And I think, and I'd like to point particularly here to the recent defection of Kekel, who is a prominent general in the RSF who was responsible for crimes in Jazeera, to the army with much celebration, and the army heralding that he's now on the side of goodness. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Please, to the gentleman with the pink shirt here. No, yes.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. And thank you, the panelists, for their submissions. I've actually been inspired, especially by His Excellency Ambassador Dr. Angok James Solomon Padiet and Khaled. You know, your submissions have actually been so awesome. So I actually have some questions for, first of all, Dr. Angok James Solomon. As he was actually starting, it was like USA and Europe, actually they give more attention to this war. Okay, was like, my question is, why is Europe, USA more concerned about the war, as Dr. Angok James Solomon said, than actually the Africans, with the Africans, whose brothers and sisters are actually being slaughtered in actually Sudan? That's the first question. And then he pointed out actually the issue of bully that USA came in South Sudan. And actually I've been inspired, I've liked the issue of bully, because I remember Daglo came to Uganda and met His Excellency President William Museveni. And also you talk about Egypt having taken the side of the SAF, right? So why can these two parties, for example, work as the bully and actually pin these two individuals to bring peace in Sudan, so that actually the people, the civilians, can actually not be actually dying nonsensically in a war that actually can actually be brought to in the end. The other second question is, which organizations or entities on the African continent should be spearheading or are spearheading the end of this conflict? Because ideally it's their mandate as it is, because I don't see other brothers in the house here who are not from Uganda. I really personally don't see them as foreigners in Uganda. I see them as actually Africans, so they are not foreigners to my actual perception. They are our Africans, they are our brothers and sisters, they're not foreigners. So actually, the war happening in Sudan is happening in our own house, with the Ugandans, the Kenyans, you know, in Congo, everywhere. So I mean, our own entities or organizations on the African continent, that's the African Union, talk of the IGAD, they should be at the forefront of at least trying to bring peace in Sudan, and they should be engaging the parties that have actually taken the sides at least. So why aren't, okay, are they really doing that, or why, if not, they're not doing it? The other question is, if that is answered, then I would really want to know, are the Africans, actually African brothers and sisters, especially in the positions of power, interested in ending the war? If not, which the other parties of the US and Europe that are interested in the war, as you said, Dr. Angok, are they this time or apparently interested in ending it, or they are still looking at other aspects of involvement before they can actually bring it to the end? Because if you say that they are more concerned about the war, that's Europe and USA or other parties or other continents, it means they have the power to end it. So why aren't they doing it?
Okay, thank you very much. We need to have, maybe the gentleman with the left microphone, if you can start giving the microphone to the gentleman here, and then the gentleman with the, yes, in the back, but first left.
Thank you very much. My name is Wandera Destin Austin. Okay. My question is a little bit in line to my colleagues. Ambassador Dr. James stated that Africa isn't so much interested in, or hasn't shown much interest in the war going on in Sudan. So I'm inquiring, is it because of the dualistic nature of the state of Sudan as it is, or is it that Africa just doesn't have interest in portraying what is happening in Sudan? Yet, if we take it from a context from Uganda being affiliated to the East African community, I'm pretty sure it has interests with South Sudan continuing up to Sudan. So I would like to understand why there isn't so much interest from the African state as it is. Thank you.
Thank you. Microphone left, please, to the gentleman in a blue shirt, and then the question up there. Please, the gentleman on top, yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, moderator. My name is Leandro Komakech, a former member of parliament from Gulu. I used to sit in the Committee of Foreign Affairs of the Parliament of Uganda. Now, my interest is two. One, to the ambassador. You made a very unorthodox statement, which is outside diplomatic engagements, that possibly we need bullies in the region to move to this place. So I was imagining how the ECOMOG used to do in West Africa. Do you think the role of ECOMOG and what they played in many of the engagements in the West African states could be a sample or a model that the AU and whatever kind of arrangement can be done could be the best way to facilitate or to enforce peace in Sudan? And then my colleague I worked with for 10 years, Mr. Okello, at Refugee Law Project. It looks like the supplies to these two groups are constant? Are there conflict entrepreneurs in the region that are actually making sure this war do not end? Because with all this firing of guns every day throughout for 1 year, if they were internally engaging, all the armaments would have gone, all the ammunitions have gone. So where are the supplies of the RSF? A militia force, so to say, but seems to have very loaded support from some other neighboring states. What is the position of Security Council? What is the position of AU? Because it looks like diplomacy may not work on the issue regarding the WISE panel. The WISE panel for now may wait later. Looks like we need to go for real stuff. Can we assemble troops in South Sudan? Can we assemble troops in Egypt? How can we make sure that we round up all supplies so that this war can come to an end? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Deputy. And now the gentleman in the blue shirt.
Thank you. My name is Fuad Osman. I'm Sudanese. I'm a political actor and writer. First, thank you for my greeting and appreciation to the organizers of this conference. And as Sudanese, we are grateful to the government and people of Uganda for their swift and flexible response in welcoming Sudanese refugees, facilitating their asylum procedures, and allowing freedom of movement. Actually, the cause of ongoing war are complex, closely tied to the country political history, the military role, it is authoritarian ambitions, and the repeated coups it has orchestrated. The war in Sudan since 1955, before the independence in South Sudan and in Darfur, in Nuba Mountain, South Kordofan, and south of Blue Nile State. The situation deteriorated further following the rise of the Islamists after 1989 coup. The Islamists fragmented the military, established parallel forces loyal to them, fired officers not aligned with them, but members were installed in their places, divert resources to other forces such as Operation Authority within security forces, legalized the RSF in 2017, serving all this to balance the internal conflicts of Omar al-Bashir regime. This strategy ensures that no single entity held a monopoly on arms, resulting in multiple factions loyal to al-Bashir and making it increasingly difficult to mobilize against him. He effectively tied his survival to the survival of the country, so that any movement against him risked igniting armed conflicts. All these armies have become entangled in politics. After the Sudanese overthrew the Bashir, the transitional government, the civilian government, inherited this heavy burden, those faction armies. And all of these armies entangled in politics, competing for power, and following regime deeply entrenched in institutions. To regain power, Bashir regime exploited the divisions with the military. The Prime Minister, Mr. Hamdok, sorry, but this is, I think it is very important to know the context. The Prime Minister of the transitional government took initiatives to bridge the gap between the army and the RSF to avoid war, emphasizing that existence of multiple armies threatening Sudan's stability. Additionally, armed movement in Darfur region signed peace agreement in Juba 2020. However, in October 2020, 2021, the army, the RSF, and part of the movement, armed movement in Darfur, that signed the peace agreement, along with Islamists, staged coup against the civilian government. After that, RSF discovered potential return of Islamists following that coup. This led to renewed dialogues between civilian, military, and the RSF later, resulted some by framework agreement in 2022, before the war, to merge the objective of that framework agreement, to merge military into unified army, but Islamists and part of the armed movement led by the Darfur governor called Minna Kuminawi and the Minister of Finance, Dr. Jibril Ibrahim, took that agreement outside. And the war is ignited April 2023. I want to ask the panelists, what is the consequences of fact-finding mission established by HRC in Geneva? And also, Mr. Ambassador, Excellency Ambassador, as a civilian, we established a wide democratic civil front called Tagadum. We're trying to coordinate the different negotiation platforms and unified them, regionally and internationally. And we, till now, communicate with the two warring parties, SAF and RSF, to negotiate and to start the inclusive peace talks. Your model to build the two generals without civilian, do you think this is the best model or will lead to reignite the war later? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Sorry, we have quite a few questions right now, so I would like to ask the panelists to give brief answers to each question that was addressed to them. And I would like to ask Mr. Okele to start off the answering.
Thanks once again. I would like to start from this question about the politics of the outbreak of war. I mean, obviously, in the amount of time we were given and not knowing exactly where everybody is in this conflict, we couldn't just go historically. But that having been said, it's very important to understand the question of who shot the first shot and why did they shoot it, right? And I'm not quite sure we know the answer very well to that question. Was it the RSF? Was it the SAF? And what did they intend by shooting that first shot? So there's a bunch of conversations to be had around there. I think an associated conversation has to do with what was going on within, what was that committee called? There was I forget the name, but there's a committee, a transitional justice type committee that was instituted in Sudan that was meant to look into the history of the country and deconstruct some of the legacies of Bashir, which then created quite a bit of tension between the different parties. And there's a lot to be said about that, because the last I was in Khartoum just before the conflict started, this was a very serious issue, and there was a conversation going on in Khartoum. So those two are very important to know. The question of Hamdok, at a personal level, I think Sudan needed a solution, but Hamdok was too clean for the problem, right? The nature of the problem that you had in Sudan, in my opinion, having been privy to some of the conversation that led to the selection of Hamdok, in my opinion, Hamdok was not the right person for the job, in the sense that the job needed somebody slightly dirty, someone out of the woodwork. You clean them up and give them a framework within which to operate, but one that is trusted on both ends of the spectrum, which something which Hamdok completely lacked, and something which created a stalemate within the leadership. Just to touch briefly on this question, I mean, there's this misconception that African institutions were not involved in the conflict, and I don't speak for any of them, but just to outline the litany of institutions. For those who are familiar with Sudan, you will remember such a thing as the trilateral mechanism, which was the combination of AU, IGAD, and UN, which existed in there way before the conflict started. And in fact, the last time I was in Khartoum, one of the challenges that the trilateral mechanism was dealing with was this very question of what to do about the then widening rift between Dagalo and Burhan. So there was the trilateral mechanism, and immediately after the conflict broke out, there was another trilateral mechanism momentarily led by Salva Kiir, which very quickly turned into a quartet, and this was an IGAD mechanism. Unfortunately, all of these things got overtaken by, in my opinion, American impatience. You know, there was a bit of impatience there, and they created these other Jeddah processes, which whose outcomes, obviously, we know. Getting specifically to Leandro's question, who supplies the actors? And I think, in some ways, this is the elephant in the room. Where are these folks getting their supplies, both militarily, both in terms of cash, because you know, hardware alone is not enough. You need cash to do all manner of things. From what we've been able to establish, obviously, Sudan had a complex military industrial, enterprise running on, involving a network of banks, involving what my colleague talked about, a network of agricultural enterprises, involving the control of forex, agricultural machinery, and so on and so forth. So we know that once war broke out, and even slightly before war broke out, there was a slow disembowelment of some of these institutions by the different factions, perhaps in preparation for the eventual outcome, which is conflict. So there were some internal resources, and that also goes hand in hand with what the RSF controls in the Darfur areas, the gold mines, which somehow become of interest to Wagner, at its current iteration. So you've got gold. Gold goes both ends. The SAF also has some withheld resources, and that's just in the internal sort of resource basket. Obviously, goes back again to who is taking the proceeds from South Sudanese oil. There's a bit of that. My concern about supply has a lot to do with the broader concept of the hybridization of conflict, which we are seeing going on around the region. Iranian drones are very important, very central to the continuation of the conflict in Sudan, and the undulation of that conflict. The move towards Khartoum, the most recent, has a lot to do with the supply, the drop and hide in supply of those particular weapons. Now, whether those drones are bought through back channels, we're not able to say, but this is a very big one. On the other hand, the counter-drone technology that occasionally is utilized by the UAE, by the RSF, is a UAE sort of thing. So there are channels. We've heard about, without any hard evidence to this, we've heard about planes, for those who are into tracking plane movements. We've heard about planes, doing UAE, Entebbe, Chad, sort of movement. And we've also heard about some Israeli associated aeronautic companies somewhere in this country. I mean, obviously, these are all loose bits of loose bits of pathways to pursue if you want to get to the very extreme of who is behind the supply of the actors. And very lastly, the question about the consequences of the fact-finding report of the HRC. I'm afraid to say the HRC report is just that. It's a report. It may do a bit of naming and shaming here and there, and of course it has done that through the violations that it has attributed to the different actors. But for as long as the HRC remains a body without any enforcement mechanism, the best they can do is shout and scream. So something more than that, more than a report is needed. And that's not to undermine the gravity of the violations that have been committed in Sudan by all sides, including these other armed groups that are not frequently mentioned. I think those are the questions that were directly pointed at me.
Thank you very much. Mr. Khaled, can I ask you to answer your questions?
Well, I listed the questions, but I don't remember one of them being directed at me directly. But generally, the colleague from the US who lived in Khartoum has a legitimate question about, we're discussing where this is going without discussing where it came from, and that we need to look at the background story of what led to this war, which was later described by Fuad. And yes, I agree. We need to keep our eyes looking at where this came from in development of new solutions in the future. Fuad mentioned the issue of that Hemeti discovered the Islamists and then went for the framework agreement. This, I don't really see this as Hemeti's main motivator, combating or fighting or avoiding Islamists. Currently, after the war, the amount of Islamists that defected and joined the RSF are nearly as much as those that appear to be on the army's side. So you have Islamists on both sides, as was also mentioned in the panel. And with regard to the framework agreement, the last breaking point right before the war started was the hold-up on the issue of the years that it will take to integrate the RSF into the army. The root cause of everything we are talking about is having two armed forces in one country. So top of the agenda on the framework agreement was integrating all of the armies, not only the RSF, by the way, into one army. The RSF said that they agree, but they will do it in 20 years. So imagine them being present for 20 years and signing on that and committing to that after 20 years. That was a far-out promise. So yeah, these are.
Thank you very much. Mr. Ambassador?
Yeah, let me come to why Africa is not much involved. Rather, US is taking the lead. And that links also to why intervention is not happening quickly. And it linked to the undiplomatic language of the bully. Let me bring you back a bit also to the hybrid type of the government that came after al-Bashir was hosted. So the civilian wing and then the military wing. That was the first blunder, actually, in the Sudan crisis. You don't mix the military with the civilian, and you think that that government can run smoothly in a democratic manner. It doesn't work. And that was a blunder. That hybrid itself, which brought Hamadok to become the prime minister, and then Al-Burhan controlled the army, and his deputy was Hamadok, Hemeti, or Hamadoglo. That was a wrong mixture, actually. So that mixture is what gave us the consequence of what happened later. So what was the consequence of the mixture is to host the civilian aspect. They hosted al-Bashir as military, and then the civilian came, and then when the transitional period was almost ending so that the power is ended to the military, to the civilian, then they hosted the civilian. And then they remain as the military. Now, when they remain as the ministry, the question is who is next to be hosted? That was the scary question. So, before Burhan could host Hemeti, or before Hemeti could host Burhan from power, one has to do something. This is typically military tactics. So, from what we heard in formal sources, because we are Sudanese also, I think Hemeti was tipped with this, what he said, integration of his forces into the armed forces mean eliminating him from the military power. So before he could get eliminated, then he need to do something. So that's why he also thought of eliminating Al-Burhan before he could eliminate him. So this became now who should eliminate who first. That was the whole spike of the problem. And that's why it's becoming very complicated to resolve it, because it involves who should get out and who should remain in all this. Now, that hybrid is out. So the civilians are powerless in the conflict of Sudan as we speak. Neither the civil society nor the political parties, they are just powerless. They have to wait for a certain time. The time now is not for them. The time is for the two marshals. They are not generals. They have even gone beyond generals. Field marshal. So that's why diplomacy has failed. And Komakate, for us in diplomatic training, if diplomacy fails, you go to the last resort. And the last resort is some kind of bullying, which bullying is also some kind of military. I don't want to use military intervention, which somebody asked why there is no intervention. Already there is humanitarian intervention, there is a diplomatic intervention. What does remain is the military intervention. Once you have exhausted this and they have failed and there is no peace, even the United Nations has Chapter 7. That is what you call military intervention. Now, even if US is involved, they are scared to get into that option because of the lesson from Somalia case. You have known what happened with the intervention in Somalia. And also the nature of politics in Sudan and the actors. A number of them are Islamists and some of them are being trained in jihadism. So US is very careful to get into the naves of jihadists. So intervening directly militarily is not an option. Now, they have to do what you call paralysis. You paralyze them by allowing war a chance so that they fight for some time. Then after they fight. 1 year is finished, another year. Now we are in the second year, we might go to third year. It will paralyze the two warring parties. So that paralysis is where the intervention could be possible. But if both of them are seriously strong, it's very difficult to intervene. There are also very negative sentiments on peacekeeping forces coming to Sudan because of the issue of trusteeship. Trusteeship is being detested in the Sudanese politics. They don't like it. So if you intervene even under the pretext of peacekeeping forces, they will regard it as a trusteeship. You coming to take over from them. So this makes the intervention direct using military seem impossible, particularly for US. So that's why US is following a long route of diplomacy. You take them to Jeddah today, tomorrow, Geneva, the other year, you take them there until things calm down. So intervention is difficult in that. Who can do the intervention? That's what brings me to the question of the ECOWAS, the West African style. It is done typically by the African. Non-African don't get there with that type of military bullying to intervene to stop a fighting. So that's where somebody say, where is the East Africa in this? Let me get you back to what I said before. The duality of Sudan make East Africa a bit reserved. Because if they go, they will jump out, we say Arab are being attacked. You get it? Yes, Arab are being attacked. Then you get into a negative campaign. And now, if the Arab come the other side, they will say African are being attacked. You get it? So it's both ways because of the duality of the Sudanese nature of politics. Arabs, African. So it makes it a bit difficult for the East African to intervene. Even IGAD are finding it a bit harder in one way or another. So that's where it has to become individual a bit now. For example, if they manage to bring Al-Burhan alone, put him down, show him the consequence and show him the benefit if he agree. What do you call the sticks and carrots? They can utilize that, but it needs a bully who has a leverage on him. The same thing with Hemeti. It needs that a bully who can give him a carrot or a stick. But then the question remains, even if you bring them together, they negotiated peace settlement, push on their throat, will they accept to hand over power to the civilian? That was the big elephant that has destroyed Khartoum, handing power to the civilian. That is what made them to host the civilian element in power out. Even if you come up with a peace agreement between them, where do you get in? This is where sometimes we leave some natural order to take its course. And then from there, the civilian can come in. But right now, what you need to settle is the problem of the military and keep the civilian at the bay. They can discuss and move around, but they are not needed at the moment. It is this military so that the war can be stopped. Then after that, after the war has been stopped, then you can come now and open the civilian transition in this. One point that a number of us, yes, that is the last point, we have not mentioned. In Arabic, they call it Izal Tamkin. You know, the National Congress Party and the rest of the parties that have ruled in Sudan and their military affiliates, they have made resources out of the public resources. So some have made businesses and whatever. So when Hamadou came with this government, he started targeting those people and saying they must return whatever they have taken. Or if they have big house, that house must be confiscated and given back to the government. And all because it is the resources of the government that has been diverted by somebody. So that's what they call in Arabic Izal Tamkin. You have established yourself with something which is not yours, so it must be brought back. That thing has sent hot knives to those people who had this money. So they are now the main supporters of the SAF, those people who did not like return of the stolen public resources. They are the ones supporting the SAF now, more than the RSF. And RSF has its own also corruption issues. So also if you ask them to bring this thing back, they will never agree to concede to any peace agreement. So part of the carrot is to tell them what we want is peace so that the civilians are not displaced anymore. So keep your money. Okay, keep your money, give it to your children, let them invest. We can use the Museveni way. Invest it in Sudan, don't take it outside. Like he said, a Ugandan thief should invest in Uganda. That is the best. But if they take it outside, then Museveni has a problem with them. So it's the same style. You could also use that carrot, that we will not touch you this time because this is Tamkin the other time brought a problem. So keep your money, invest it, but we want peace. In the long run, when stability comes, legal cases can still be initiated. Law does not rust, as they say. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So, unfortunately, our time is up. Thank you, dear panelists. Thank you for your thoughtful insights. And there is definitely some more discussion on jihadism and other topics at the very first conference and panel tomorrow. So hopefully there is also space for more questions. Thank you, dear audience, and thank you again. Please join me in applauding.
A very intense conversation this has been. Ladies and gentlemen, let's add another round of applause to the previous panel. It was as insightful, as tense, as educational, all that in one aspect. Ladies and gentlemen, I know that it's been quite a long day, and I'm not here to argue any other thing on the bucket list, but what we're just going to have for this evening is a cultural presentation. Now, if you just move right outside, you'll be able to get the full glimpse of our cultural presentation as we end off this day. And we also have some bites and drinks for you to be able to pick up on as we get to close off this day. So it's just going to be exchanging pleasantries, saying hello to each other. And tomorrow we kick off at exactly 9:30. So I do request that we are here all in by 9, having had our breakfast. Tomorrow we only have 3 panels, and that is going to be 2 panels in the morning and 1 panel in the afternoon. You don't want to miss the panel on jihadism and global networks. Neither do you want to miss the panel on the oil's impact on Uganda's future, but also navigating Africa's evolving economic partnerships. So all that will be coming through tomorrow. These beautiful art pieces continue as we have the conversations. The talent right there is being exhibited as the different art pieces actually get to speak to the conversations we are having. Today was basically and mostly about peace and security and human rights. I want to say a special thank you to each and every one of you for coming. Thank you so much. Wishing you the very best of the evening. Journey masses as you get back home, and until we meet again tomorrow, good evening and God bless you. But please do not leave us with a cultural presentation. Alliance Francaise has definitely prepared something spectacular for us as we also join together and bite on something for the evening. Thank you. We'll meet again tomorrow on this very podium.
Soft winds are singing. Olikaomba bunga kumutwe Oli kaombo ponga, como te mama.